It started as a simple walk to clear my head. The frozen lake was a favorite spot of mine during winter, a vast, silent expanse that seemed to stretch forever. The air was crisp, biting at my cheeks, and the snow crunched under my boots as I approached the lake. The surface was smooth, glistening faintly under the dim light of the overcast sky. I stepped onto the ice cautiously, as I always did. The thickness had been tested earlier in the season, and people often came here to skate or fish. Today, though, it was deserted. The silence was almost oppressive, broken only by the occasional groan of the ice shifting beneath me. It was strange how something so vast and still could feel alive, as if the lake itself was watching. I walked further out, enjoying the solitude. The trees surrounding the lake stood like dark sentinels, their branches bare and skeletal. My breath puffed out in clouds that quickly disappeared into the cold. I stopped in the center of the lake, looking around. It was beautiful in a way that made me feel small and insignificant, like I had stumbled into a place untouched by time. That's when I noticed it. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light. A shadow moved beneath the ice, slow and deliberate. I froze, my heart pounding. It was faint, almost imperceptible, but it was there. Something dark, elongated, and sinuous. My rational mind struggled to make sense of it. Maybe it was a crack forming, or debris caught in the ice shifting with the pressure. But deep down, I knew it wasn't that simple. I crouched down, peering closer at the ice. The surface was clear in place, like glass, revealing the murky depths below. My breath fogged up the surface, and I wiped it away with my glove, trying to see better. The shadow moved again, faster this time. It seemed to ripple, as though it was swimming. My stomach churned. There shouldn't be anything alive in a frozen lake, especially something that size. The logical part of me screamed to leave, to go back to solid ground and forget what I'd seen. But curiosity held me there. I followed the shadow with my eyes, watching as it weaved beneath the ice. It was mesmerizing in a horrible way, like to the void, and having it stare back. I couldn't tell how deep it was, but the darkness seemed to go on forever. Suddenly it stopped. The shadow lingered directly beneath me, motionless. I felt an inexplicable sense of dread, as if it knew I was there, as if it was looking up at me through the ice. My breath caught in my throat, and the air seemed colder, heavier. I wanted to move, to run, but my legs refused to obey. I was rooted to the spot, paralyzed by fear. Then, the ice groaned loudly, a deep, resonant sound that vibrated through my bones. A crack appeared nearby, thin but unmistakable, snaking across the surface toward me. Panic surged through me, breaking the spell. I stumbled backward, my boots sliding on the slick surface. Cracks spread, branching out like a spider web, and the shadow beneath me began to rise. It wasn't just a shadow anymore. I could see shapes, something moving, twisting, coiling. Details were hard to make out, but it was massive, larger than anything I'd ever seen. My mind raced, struggling to comprehend what I was witnessing. It wasn't natural. It couldn't be. I turned and ran, my heart pounding so hard it felt like it would burst. The ice groaned louder, and I could hear the faint sound of cracking beneath my feet with every step. The shadow followed, keeping pace with me, just beneath the surface. It was faster than I expected, and the realization made my blood run cold. I didn't dare look back. I didn't want to see what was chasing me. The shore seemed impossibly far away. My legs burned, and my breath came in ragged gasps. The ice creaked ominously, and I knew it was only a matter of time before it gave way. A part of me wanted to scream, but the cold air caught in my throat, and all I could do was run. Then, I felt it. A thud reverberated through the ice, strong enough to make me stumble. Whatever was beneath me had hit the surface, testing it, searching for a weak point. I scrambled to regain my footing, my eyes fixed on the trees ahead. Just a little farther. I could make it. Another thud, closer this time. The ice groaned, and I heard a sharp crack behind me. I didn't dare turn around. The shore was so close now. Just a few more steps. My legs felt like lead, but I pushed forward, driven by pure adrenaline and the primal need to survive. Finally, I reached solid ground. I collapsed onto the snow, gasping for air, my body trembling, turned back toward the lake, half expecting to see the ice shattered, and whatever was beneath it, breaking through. But the surface was still eerily calm, as if nothing had happened. The cracks I'd seen were gone, and the shadow was nowhere to be found. For a moment, I thought I'd imagined it all, that my mind had played some cruel trick on me. But then I saw them, tracks in the snow, leading away from the edge of the lake. They were faint, almost indistinct, but unmistakable. Long, clawed impressions, like nothing I'd ever seen before. They led toward the trees, disappearing into the shadows. I stared at them, my mind racing. Whatever was under the ice hadn't stayed there. It had followed me. My chest tightened as I realized I wasn't safe. Not here, not anywhere. The forest around me felt alive with unseen eyes, watching, waiting. I forced myself to stand, my legs shaking beneath me. I didn't know where to go, but I couldn't stay there. I backed away slowly, keeping my eyes on the trees, my breath visible in short, panicked bursts. The silence was deafening, and every crunch of snow under my boots felt like a shout in the void. As I turned to leave, I heard it. A faint sound, barely more than a whisper, carried on the icy wind. It was coming from the lake, a low, guttural noise that sent shivers down my spine. I didn't wait to hear more. I ran, not stopping until I was far from the lake, far from the tracks, far from whatever had been moving beneath the ice. Even now, I can't explain what I saw. I've tried to convince myself it was nothing, just my mind, playing tricks on me. But I can't forget the shadow, the way it moved, the way it seemed to know. I was there, and I can't forget the tracks, or the feeling the thing followed me home. Sometimes, late at night, I hear the same low, guttural sound outside my window, and I wonder if the ice was ever enough to keep it contained. It started the morning after the blizzard. The snow had fallen thick and fast all night, covering the world in a heavy white blanket. The air was still and quiet, if the storm had drained all sound from the world. I wrapped myself in my warmest coat, boots crunching through the untouched snow, and stepped outside to clear the path to my driveway. That's when I saw it. There was a playground at the edge of the woods behind my house. It hadn't been there before. The swings hung still, chains glinting with frost. A slide, coated in a smooth layer of ice, sparkled in the weak winter sun. A merry-go-round stood crooked, its faded paint peeling under the weight of snow. The entire scene felt old, forgotten, and yet new. I had walked these woods 100 times. I knew them like the back of my hand. That playground wasn't there. Yesterday, curiosity gnawed at me. The rational part of my mind tried to explain it. Maybe the storm had revealed it. Maybe it had always been there, hidden under years of overgrowth. But that didn't make sense. The snow-covered equipment looked freshly placed, as if someone had built it during the night. Who would do that? And why here? I hesitated before walking toward it. The closer I got, the stranger it felt. The air grew colder, biting against my skin even through my layers. My breath fogged in front of me, hanging heavy in the stillness. My boots sank deeper into the snow, each step making a hollow crunch that echoed in the silence. When I reached the edge of the playground, I froze. The swings were moving, not wildly, as if pushed by the wind, but gently, back and forth, like someone had just been sitting there. I looked around, searching for tracks in the snow, but there were none. The snow was perfect, unbroken except for my own footprints. A chill ran down my spine, and I almost turned back. But something about the playground pulled at me. It felt wrong, yes, but it also felt like it was waiting for me. Against my better judgment, stepped closer. I walked to the merry-go-round first. The snow crunched beneath my boots as I brushed a layer and off one of the seats. The metal underneath was ice cold, sending a jolt through gloves. I gave at a small push, and it creaked loudly, the sound slicing through the quiet like a knife. It spun for a moment before stopping abruptly, as if something unseen had grabbed it. I backed away, my heart pounding. The slide was next. It leaned slightly to one side, the ice on its surface glimmering like glass. There was something at the top of it, something small, half buried in the snow. I climbed an icy ladder, my hands slipping on the cold rungs, and reached the top. It was a doll. Its porcelain, the face was cracked, one eye missing, the other staring blankly at me. Its dress was tattered, the fabric stiff with frost. I picked it up, and the cold from me seemed to seep into my skin, even through my gloves. A loud creak made me nearly drop it. I spun around. The swing set was moving again, but this time, the swings were swaying harder, as if someone or something was using them. The chains groaned under the weight of an invisible force. I stumbled back down the slide, the doll still clutched in my hand, and turned to leave. I had seen enough. This place wasn't normal. It wasn't right. But as I tried to walk away, something stopped me. It wasn't a sound or a touch, but a feeling, a heavy, suffocating weight pressing down on me. I looked back at the playground. The swings had stopped moving. The merry-go-round was still. Everything was silent again, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The air grew colder, and the sky darkened, though the sun hadn't moved. The snow around me seemed to deepen, rising up to my knees, making it harder to move. Panic bubbled in my chest as I fought to wade through it. The doll slipped from my grip, sinking into the snow, but I didn't stop to pick it up. I just wanted to get away. Then I heard it. A faint giggle, high-pitched and echoing, carried on the still air. It came from behind me, from the direction of the playground. I didn't turn around. I didn't want to see what was there. I forced myself to keep moving, my breath coming in sharp, panicked gasps. The giggle came again, closer this time, followed by the sound of small footsteps crunching through the snow. I broke into a run, my feet slipping and sinking, my heart hammering in my chest. The footsteps followed, faster now, matching my pace. I reached the edge of the woods, the familiar sight of my house just ahead. Relief surged through me as I stumbled onto my porch, slamming the door shut behind me. I pressed my back against it, trying to catch my breath, my ears straining for any sound outside. Nothing, just silence. I peered out the window, but the woods were empty. I told myself it was over, that I was safe, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed me. The house felt different, colder, darker. The shadows in the corners seemed to shift when I wasn't looking. And then I saw it. The doll. It was sitting on my kitchen table, its single eye staring at me, its cracked smile wide. And, knowing, I hadn't brought it inside. I had dropped it in the snow. My hands trembled as I backed away, my breath catching in my throat. A faint giggle echoed through the house. The lights flickered and went out, and then I heard the swing chains creak. It was late afternoon when I first saw the footprints. The sun was setting, casting long, eerie shadows through the trees. I had gone out for a walk, enjoying the air and the crunch of leaves under my boots. The woods near my house had always been peaceful, a place to clear my mind. But that day, something felt different. I almost missed the footprints at first. They started near the edge of the trail, faint and uneven, like someone had stumbled. I might not have noticed them if it weren't for the color. Bright red, against the brown and orange leaves. Blood. I stopped, my heart skipping a beat. The prints were small, too small to belong to an adult. My first thought was that a child was hurt and needed help. I called, my voice echoing through the trees. "Hello, is anyone there?" No response, just the rustling of leaves in the wind. I waited for a moment, my breath fogging in the cold air. When nothing happened, I made a decision. I couldn't just walk away. I had to find whoever had left those footprints. I followed the trail. The footprints led off the main path, deeper into the woods. They were uneven, as if the person had been limping, and every few steps, There was a small smear of blood where they had paused or fallen. The farther I went, the quieter the forest became. The usual sounds of birds and rustling, animals faded, replaced by an oppressive silence. I told myself it was just my imagination. The woods always seemed quieter in the evening, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. The trail of footprints grew more erratic. They zigzagged between trees, sometimes stopping abruptly before continuing again. The blood spots grew larger, darker. Whoever it was, they were losing a lot of blood. My chest tightened with worry. How far could they have gone in this condition? Then I saw something that made my stomach turn. A piece of fabric, torn and blood-stained, caught on a low branch. I picked it up with trembling hands. It looked like part of a child's shirt. My mind raced with possibilities, none of them good. Was someone hurt? Or was it something worse? The woods grew darker as I pressed on, the sun almost gone now. The shadows seemed to close in around me, and every step felt heavier. I tried to keep my breathing steady, but it was hard. The air felt thick, suffocating. I wanted to turn back, to run home and call for help, but the footprints were leading somewhere. I had to know where. Finally, I reached a small clearing. The bloody footprints stopped here, pooling into a dark, sticky patch on the ground. My heart pounded as I looked around. The clearing was empty, but something about it felt wrong. The trees seemed taller, they were twisting together to form a canopy that blocked out the sky. The air was colder here, biting against my skin. Then I saw it. In the center of the clearing stood a wooden structure, barely more than a frame. It looked like an prime, old hunting blind, but it was in ruins, the wood dark and rotting. The bloody footprints led straight to it. My chest tightened as I stepped closer, the sound of boots muffled by the thick carpet of leaves. The closer I got, the stronger the smell became, a sickly, metallic stench that turned my stomach. I covered my nose and mouth, my eyes watering as I approached the structure. Something was inside. I could feel it. I hesitated, every instinct screaming at me to turn back. Feet moved on their own, carrying me forward. I reached the doorway, my hands trembling as I pushed the creaking door open. Inside was darkness. The faint light from the clearing barely reached beyond but I could make out shapes. Something was piled in the corner, covered in a tattered cloth. The smell was overwhelming now, and I gagged, fighting the urge to run. Slowly, I stepped inside, my boots sticking to the blood-slick floor. I reached out to the pile in the corner, my hand shaking as I pulled the cloth away. What I saw made my blood run cold. It was a doll, a child's doll, its porcelain face cracked and smeared with blood. Its glassy eyes stared up at me, unblinking. But that wasn't all. Beneath it was something worse. Bones. Small, delicate bones, arranged in a twisted, unnatural way. My stomach lurched, and I stumbled back, nearly slipping on the blood. That's when I heard it. A faint, wet sound, like something dragging across the floor. It came from deeper inside the structure, where the shadows were thickest. My breath caught in my throat as I turned toward the noise, my heart pounding so loudly I could barely hear anything else. "Hello?" I whispered, my voice barely audible. The dragging sound stopped. For a moment, there was silence. Then, slowly, something moved. In the darkness, a shape, hunched and grotesque, emerged from the shadows. Its skin was pale and stretched tight over its bones, its eyes sunken in black. Blood dripped from its hands, pooling on the floor beneath it. I couldn't move. I couldn't scream. All I could do was stare as it crawled toward me, its movements jerky and unnatural. It opened its mouth, revealing rows of jagged, yellow teeth, and let out a low, guttural growl that sent chills down my spine. Finally, my body obeyed me. I turned and ran, bursting out of the structure and into the clearing. The air felt even colder now, burning my lungs as I sprinted back toward the trail. I didn't look back. I couldn't. The sound of dragging and growling followed me, growing louder, closer. The woods seemed endless. The trees loomed over me, their twisted branches clawing at the sky. My legs burned, and my vision blurred with tears. but I didn't stop. I couldn't stop. Finally, I saw the edge of the woods. The sight of my house in the distance filled me with a fleeting sense of relief. I stumbled onto the main trail, my boots slipping on the blood-slick leaves, and made it home. I slammed the door behind me, locking it and collapsing onto the floor. My chest heaved as I tried to catch my breath, my ears straining for any sound outside. But there was nothing. Just silence. For days, I didn't go back into the woods. I tried to convince myself it was over, that I was safe. But every night, I heard it. A faint, dragging sound outside my window. And sometimes, when I looked out into the darkness, I saw two sunken black eyes staring back at me. The wind howled around me, a deafening roar that drowned out my thoughts. As I trudged through the blizzard, snow swirled in every direction, blinding and relentless, stinging my face and seeping through the layers of my clothes. I shouldn't have been out there, but I didn't have a choice. My car had broken down miles from the nearest town, and there was no shelter in sight. My only hope was to keep moving, to find help before the cold swallowed me whole. The storm was so intense that I couldn't hear anything but the wind. It felt like the world had been erased, leaving only white emptiness. I kept my head down and my eyes squinted, focusing on putting one foot in front of the other. The snow was deep, and every step was a struggle. But I couldn't stop. If I stopped, I knew I wouldn't start again. That's when I heard it. At first, I thought it was my imagination, a trick of the wind. But then it came again soft, high, pitched, and unmistakable. Laughter. The laughter of a child. Clear and bright, cutting through the storm like a knife. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. It didn't make sense. There couldn't be a child out here. Not in this storm, not in the middle of nowhere. But the sound came again, closer this time. It echoed in the wind, bouncing off the unseen trees around me. "Hello?" I called out, my voice hoarse and trembling. The wind snatched my words and carried them away, leaving me in silence once more. The laughter came again, softer now, almost playful. It sounded like it was coming from somewhere ahead of me, deeper into the storm. My instincts screamed at me to turn back, to go in the opposite direction, but my feet wouldn't obey. If there was a child out here, they needed help, and if I didn't follow the sound, who else would? I started walking again, my steps quicker now, the snow crunching loudly beneath me. The laughter guided me, drawing me forward like a beacon. It didn't sound scared or distressed. If anything, it sounded happy, carefree, but that only made it more unsettling. What kind of child would laugh in a blizzard like this? The storm seemed to grow worse as I moved deeper into it. The wind lashed at me, and the snow felt heavier, clinging to my clothes and weighing me down. The laughter stayed just out of reach, always a little further ahead. No matter how fast I walked, I couldn't catch up to it. I called out again, louder this time. "Where are you? Are you okay?" No answer. Just that eerie laughter, fading in and out like a ghost. The landscape around me began to change. The ground beneath the snow felt uneven, rising, falling in strange patterns. I realized I had wandered off the road and into the woods. The trees were barely visible through the blinding snow, their dark silhouettes looming like giants. Branches creaked and groaned in the wind, adding to the cacophony of sounds. My heart pounded in my chest, fear creeping in despite my determination. I kept moving, though, following the laughter as it echoed through the trees. The sound seemed to wrap around me, coming from all directions at once. I couldn't tell if I was getting closer or further away. Then suddenly it stopped. It started as a simple hiking trip. The forest was dense but beautiful, the kind of place where you feel disconnected from the rest of the world. I had been walking for hours, the sound of crunching leaves and the distant rustle of animals keeping me company. I wasn't following a marked trail, just exploring. That's when I saw it. The cabin stood in a small clearing, its wooden exterior darkened with age and weather. The roof sagged slightly, and the windows were covered with grime, but it seemed sturdy. There was no smoke from the chimney, No signs of life. It looked abandoned. Curiosity got the better of me. Who had built it? And why so everything? The nearest road was miles away. I stepped closer, my boots sinking into the soft moss that surrounded the cabin. As I approached, I noticed something odd. A heavy metal latch on the door. It wasn't inside the doorframe, but outside, as if someone had designed it to lock whoever was inside. My stomach churned uneasily, but I told myself it didn't mean anything. Maybe it was just an old design, a way to secure the cabin against animals. I pushed the door open with a creak, stepping inside. The air was cold and stale, with a faint, metallic smell that I couldn't place. The cabin was small, just one room, with a dusty cot in the corner and a wooden table near the window. Everything looked untouched, as if no one had been there for years. A single oil lamp sat on the table, its glass cracked but intact. I ran my fingers across it, leaving a clean streak in the dust. There were no signs of personal belongings. No clothes, no food, not even a trace of who had lived there. But the floorboards were scratched, deep grooves running in chaotic patterns. I knelt to get a closer look, my heart thudding in my chest. They weren't from furniture or tools. They looked deliberate, almost like claw marks. I stood quickly, brushing my hands on my pants. The air inside the cabin felt heavier now, pressing against my skin. I glanced at the door, at the latch, hanging loosely on the outside. A strange thought crept into my mind. What if it wasn't meant to keep something out, but to keep something in? I shook my head, trying to dispel the idea. It was ridiculous. There was no such thing as monsters or ghosts. This was just an old, abandoned cabin in the middle of the woods. Nothing more. Still, I couldn't shake the unease that prickled at the back of my neck. I decided to leave, but as I turned toward the door, I froze. Footsteps, faint but distinct, crunching through the leaves outside. My breath caught in my throat as I strained to listen. The footsteps grew louder, closer, and then stopped just outside the cabin. Whatever it was, they weren't moving. I glanced around the room, looking for anything I could use as a weapon, but there was nothing, just the oil lamp and a few splinters of wood. My hands trembled as I stepped toward the window, peeking out through the grime. The clearing was empty. I exhaled shakily, trying to calm my racing heart. Maybe it had been an animal, a deer or a fox, passing through. But as I turned back to the door, something slammed against it. I jumped, a startled cry escaping my lips. The sound came again, louder this time, as if something heavy was throwing itself against the door. The entire cabin shook, dust raining down from the ceiling. I stumbled back, my eyes fixed on the latch. It was still hanging loosely, but I knew it wouldn't hold for long. Then the noise stopped. It started as a simple hiking trip. The forest was dense but beautiful, the kind of place where you feel disconnected from the rest of the world. I had been walking for hours, the sound of crunching leaves and the distant rustle of animals keeping me company. I wasn't following a marked trail, just exploring. That's when I saw it. The cabin stood in a small clearing, its wooden exterior darkened with age and weather. The roof sagged slightly, and the windows were covered with grime, but it seemed sturdy. There was no smoke from the chimney, no signs of life. It looked abandoned. Curiosity got the better of me. Who had built it? And why so everything? The nearest road was miles away. I stepped closer, my boots sinking into the soft moss that surrounded the cabin. As I approached, I noticed something odd. A heavy metal latch on the door. It wasn't inside the doorframe, but outside, as if someone had designed it to lock whoever was inside. My stomach churned uneasily, but I told myself it didn't mean anything. Maybe it was just an old design, a way to secure the cabin against animals. I pushed the door open with a creak, stepping inside. The air was cold and stale, with a faint, metallic smell that I couldn't place. The cabin was small, just one room, with a dusty cot in the corner and a wooden table near the window. Everything looked untouched, as if no one had been there for years. A single oil lamp sat on the table, its glass cracked but intact. I ran my fingers across it, leaving a clean streak in the dust. There were no signs of personal belongings. No clothes, no food, not even a trace of who had lived there. But the floorboards were scratched, deep grooves running in chaotic patterns. I knelt to get a closer look, my heart thudding in my chest. They weren't from furniture or tools. They looked deliberate, almost like claw marks. I stood quickly, brushing my hands on my pants. The air inside the cabin felt heavier now, pressing against my skin. I glanced at the door, at the latch, hanging loosely on the outside. A strange thought crept into my mind. What if it wasn't meant to keep something out, but to keep something in? I shook my head, trying to dispel the idea. It was ridiculous. There was no such thing as monsters or ghosts. This was just an old, abandoned cabin in the middle of the woods. Nothing more. Still, I couldn't shake the unease that prickled at the back of my neck. I decided to leave, but as I turned toward the door, I froze. Footsteps, faint but distinct, crunching through the leaves outside. My breath caught in my throat as I strained to listen. The footsteps grew louder, closer, and then stopped just outside the cabin. Whatever it was, they weren't moving. I glanced around the room, looking for anything I could use as a weapon, but there was nothing, just the oil lamp and a few splinters of wood. My hands trembled as I stepped toward the window, peeking out through the grime. The clearing was empty. I exhaled shakily, trying to calm my racing heart. Maybe it had been an animal, a deer, or a fox, passing through. But as I turned back to the door, something slammed against it. I jumped, a startled cry escaping my lips. The sound came again, louder this time, as if something heavy was throwing itself against the door. The entire cabin shook, dust raining down from the ceiling. I stumbled back, my eyes fixed on the latch. It was still hanging loosely, but I knew it wouldn't hold for long. Then the noise stopped. The silence was worse. My ears strained, desperate for any sound, but there was nothing. I didn't dare move, my body frozen in place. Minutes passed, or maybe it was only seconds. It felt like an eternity. A low, guttural growl came from the other side of the door. It wasn't human. It wasn't anything I'd ever heard before. My chest tightened as I backed away, my legs trembling beneath me. The growl rose, a deep, menacing rumble braided through the floor. The latch lifted, slowly, as if something was testing it. My blood ran cold. I couldn't breathe, couldn't think. And then, with a deafening crash, burst open. I didn't see what came through. My mind wouldn't let me. It was a blur of movement, a dark, hulking shape that filled the doorway. I turned and ran, my feet slipping on the scratched floorboards. I dove behind the table, clutching the oil lamp like a lifeline. The thing entered the cabin, its growls filling the small space. I could hear its claws scraping against the wood, the heavy thud of its footsteps as it moved closer. The air reeked of rot and blood, a suffocating stench that made my stomach churn. It stopped. I could feel its presence, towering over me, just on the other side of the table. My fingers tightened around the lamp, my mind racing. I had no plan, no idea what to do. All I knew was that I couldn't stay there. With a burst of adrenaline, I hurled the lamp at it. The glass shattered on impact, oil splattering across the room. The flame caught instantly, and the cabin erupted in fire. The creature let out a deafening roar, a sound that made my bones vibrate. I didn't wait to see what happened next. I bolted for the door, leaping through the flames and into the cold air outside. I ran, the forest blurred around me, branches scratching at my face and arms. I didn't stop, didn't look back, didn't care where I was going. All I knew was that I had to get away. The roar echoed behind me, followed by a series of inhuman screeches. The fire must have spread quickly, consuming the old dry wood of the cabin. But even as the sounds faded, I didn't stop running. I couldn't. The image of that latch, that heavy, rusted metal, burned in my mind. Who had built that cabin, and why had they locked it from the outside? I didn't want to. No. But even now, I can't shake the feeling that whatever was inside wasn't destroyed. It's out. There, somewhere in the woods, waiting for the next person to stumble upon that cursed clearing. It was late afternoon when I noticed it. The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows across the forest path. I had decided to take a walk to clear my mind, hoping the crisp air and rustling leaves would soothe the unease that had been gnawing at me all day. The woods near my home had always been a peaceful place, a sanctuary where I could escape the noise of the world. But that day, they felt different. I was halfway down the trail when I saw it. My shadow, stretched out before me on the dirt path, was pointing in the wrong direction. The sun was to my right, but my shadow didn't match it, extended unnaturally to my left, long and sharp like a jagged tear in the earth. I stopped walking, staring at it in disbelief. Shadows don't do that. They follow the light, predictable and obedient. My brain scrambled for an explanation. Maybe it was a trick of the sun, filtering through the trees. Maybe my eyes were playing tricks on me. I moved, taking a step forward, and watched as my shadow moved too. But it didn't align with the sun. It twisted, bending in a way that made my stomach churn. It wasn't following me. It was acting on its own. I turned in a slow circle, watching the shadow the entire time. No matter where I moved, stayed fixed, pointing left, as if beckoning me toward the trees off the trail. My heart thudded in my chest, a cold sweat prickling the back of my neck. Shadows can't do that, I whispered to myself, my voice shaky. The forest was silent, unnervingly so. No birds chirped, no leaves rustled. Even the wind seemed to have vanished, leaving an oppressive stillness that pressed against my ears. My shadow stretched longer, darker, reaching into the forest like it was pointing at something. I hesitated. I didn't want to follow it. Every instinct told me to turn around and head back the way I came. But something about the shadow pulled at me, an invisible thread tugging at my chest. Against my better judgment, I stepped off the trail and into the trees. The forest grew denser, the light dimming as the branches above intertwined. My shadow led the way, shifting and bending like it was alive. It didn't just fall on the ground anymore. It climbed the trees, stretching along the bark, twisting around roots. It was leading me deeper, away from the safety of the trail. The air grew colder, biting at my skin. I wrapped my arms around myself, shivering. Every step felt heavier, like the ground was trying to pull me down. I tried to focus on my breathing, to steady my nerves, but the eerie silence made it impossible. It felt like the forest was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. Then, I saw it. A clearing opened up ahead, bathed in an unnatural, silvery light. My shadow stopped at the edge, pooling at my feet like ink. In the center of the clearing stood a single tree, ancient and gnarled, its branches twisting into the sky like skeletal fingers. At its base was a dark shape, crouched and motionless. I stepped closer, my heart pounding so loudly I thought it would burst. The shape came into focus, a figure, hunched over, its back to me. It looked human, but something about it was wrong. Its limbs were too long, its shoulders too broad. The air around it felt heavy, charged with something I couldn't name. "Hello?" I called out, my voice trembling. The figure didn't move. I took another step, my shadow stretching toward it like it was reaching out. The figure twitched, its head snapping up. Slowly, it turned to face me. It had no face, just a blank, smooth expanse of skin where its features should have been. Its body was pale, almost translucent, and its movements were jerky, like a puppet on strings. But what terrified me most was its shadow, long and dark, stretching in the opposite direction of mine. It mirrored every movement I made, but it wasn't attached to the figure. It was separate, independent, writhing like a living thing. I stumbled back, my breath coming in short gasps. The figure tilted its head, as if studying me. Then, it raised one long, bony finger and pointed at me. I froze. My shadow began to shift, twisting and curling, until it no longer looked like a shadow at all. It rose from the ground, stretching into a thin, spindly shape that mirrored the figure in the clearing. I felt a cold, sinking dread as the two shadows moved closer together, merging into one. The figure stepped forward, its movements slow and deliberate. I turned to run, but my legs felt heavy, like they were rooted to the ground. The shadow stretched toward me, its darkness enveloping everything in its path. "Stop!" I screamed, my voice cracking. The shadow reached me, wrapping around my feet like icy tendrils. I tried to pull away, but it held me fast, dragging me toward the clearing. The figure moved closer, its blank face tilted upward as if it were smiling at me without a mouth. Panic surged through me, and I thrashed against the shadow's grip. My hands clawed at the ground, but it was useless. The shadow pulled me into the clearing, the pale figure looming above me. Its bony finger pointed again, and this time, I felt Itan unbearable cold piercing through my chest. The world dimmed, the forest fading into nothingness. The last thing I saw was my shadow. No longer pointing in the wrong direction. It was gone, replaced by a second figure, standing motionless beside the first. And then there was only darkness. I don't know how I escaped. When I woke, I was back on the trail, the sun dipping below the horizon. My body ached, and my clothes were damp with sweat. I stumbled back to my house, locking the door behind me and refusing to look out the windows. But sometimes, late at night, I see it again, my shadow, pointing where it shouldn't. And I know, it's only a matter of time before it leads me back. The frozen lake was one of my favorite places during winter. The vast, empty sheet of ice, stretched endlessly under the pale gray sky, silent and serene. I often came here to clear my mind, to escape the noise of the world. But that day, something was different. I had wandered farther than usual, to a part of the lake where the ice seemed smoother, untouched by skaters or footprints. The cold air bit at my face, but I barely noticed. The stillness of the lake was almost hypnotic. And then, I saw it. At first, I thought it was just a crack in the ice, but as I got closer, I realized it wasn't natural. It was a door. A large rectangular shape etched into the surface of the ice, its edges unnaturally straight. The ice around it was darker, almost black, as if the door led to something deep beneath the surface. I stopped a few feet away, staring at it. It didn't make sense. There was no reason for a door to be here. It was miles from the shore, in the middle of the frozen lake. My mind raced, trying to find an explanation. Maybe it was some kind of man-made structure, a trapdoor used by fishermen or scientists. But the ice was thick and unbroken. There was no way anyone could have built something like this recently. Curiosity tugged at me, stronger than the unease building in my chest. I stepped closer, my boots crunching softly on the ice. The door was seamless, its surface smooth and glossy, unlike the rough texture of the surrounding ice. In the center, there was a handle-in old rusted ring that seemed to have been there for centuries. My breath fogged the air as I crouched down, hesitating. Something about the door felt wrong, as if it didn't belong in this world. But I couldn't walk away. I had to know what was beneath it. With trembling hands, I reached for the handle. The metal was freezing against my gloves, and it groaned faintly as I pulled. The door resisted at first, as if it didn't want to open, but then, with a sudden jolt, a rush of cold air escaped from the opening, colder than the winter wind. It smelled strange, metallic and faintly sweet, like rotting fruit. I gagged, stumbling back, but I couldn't take my eyes off the dark void beneath the door. It wasn't water or ice. It was a tunnel, descending into the darkness. I should have closed the door and left. I should have run back to the shore and forgotten about it. But something compelled me to stay. The tunnel seemed to call to me, whispering in a voice I couldn't hear but somehow felt deep in my bones. I knelt by the opening, peering inside. The walls of the tunnel were smooth, carved from the same black ice as the door. A faint, flickering light came from somewhere deep within, far beyond what I could see. It pulsed softly, like a heartbeat, drawing me closer. Before I realized what I was doing, I lowered myself into the tunnel. The ice was slippery, beneath my hands and feet, and the cold seeped through my gloves, numbing my fingers. The light grew brighter as I descended, casting strange, shifting shadows on the walls. My breath came in shallow gasps, clouding the air around me. The tunnel opened into a cavern, its walls shimmering with the same black ice. In the center of the room stood a pedestal, carved from the ice and covered in strange, jagged symbols. On the pedestal lay something small and glowing, a crystal, pulsing with that same faint, rhythmic light. I stepped closer, drawn to the crystal like a moth to a flame. The symbols on the pedestal seemed to shift and writhe as I approached, their edges blurring and changing. My head throbbed, a sharp pain cutting through my thoughts, but I couldn't stop. I reached out, my hand hovering above the stad. Crystal. The moment I touched it, the cavern shook violently, a deep, guttural sound reverberating through the ice. The light from the crystal flared, blinding me, and I stumbled back, clutching my head. The shadows on the walls grew darker, deeper, twisting into impossible shapes. I tried to run back to the tunnel, but the ice beneath me cracked and splintered, opening into jagged crevices. A cold, howling wind rushed through the cavern, carrying with it a chorus of whispers. They weren't words, not exactly, but I understood them. They were promises, threats, and something worse, something ancient and hungry. The shadows moved, detaching from the walls and converging toward me. I scrambled toward the tunnel, slipping on the ice, my heart pounding in my chest. The crystal's light flickered, wildly, casting eerie, dancing patterns across the cavern. The whispers grew louder, almost deafening, as the shadows closed in. I reached the tunnel just as the cavern began to collapse. The walls groaned and shattered, chunks of black ice falling all around me. I pulled myself up, clawing my way back toward the door. The air grew colder, the wind howling like a living thing. The shadows followed, crawling up the tunnel walls, their shapes shifting and stretching unnaturally. I burst through the door, slamming it shut behind me. The ice beneath my feet was solid again, unbroken, as if the tunnel had never existed. But I could still hear the whispers, faint and distant, coming from deep below. The door's handle glowed faintly for a moment before fading, the black ice returning to its smooth, seamless surface. I ran, my breath coming in ragged gasps, my legs trembling beneath me. The forest seemed impossibly far away, the snow blurring my vision. When I finally reached the shore, I collapsed, gasping for air, my body numb with cold and fear. I don't go near the lake anymore. I don't walk in the woods, and I don't wander off the trails. Sometimes, in the dead of night, I feel the pull of that door. I hear the whispers in my dreams, calling me back. And I know, deep down, that it's still there, waiting for someone else to find it. It started on a cold, quiet evening. The sun had set hours ago, and the streets were empty as I walked home from the bus stop. The air was bitterly cold, my breath visible in the dim light of the street lamps. The snow crunched under my boots, the sound oddly loud in the stillness. I had taken this route hundreds of times before, but something felt different that night. The neighborhood seemed too quiet, as if the usual hum of distant traffic and muffled conversations had been swallowed by the cold. I told myself it was just my imagination, the winter air playing tricks on me. That's when I noticed him. At first, I thought he was just another pedestrian, a man, tall and thin, walking a few steps behind me. He wore a dark coat, his face obscured by the shadow of his hood. I wouldn't have given him a second thought if it weren't for the way he moved, slow, deliberate, as if he were pacing himself to match my steps. I quickened my pace, my boots crunching faster against the snow. I didn't want to look back, but I couldn't help myself. I glanced over my shoulder. He was still there, the distance between us unchanged. My heart started to race. Maybe he was just heading in the same direction. Maybe I was overreacting, but I couldn't shake the unease creeping up my spine. I turned down a side street, from my house just a few blocks away. The snow here was fresh, touched, and my footprints were the only ones on the ground, except his. I glanced back again, my breath catching in my throat. He was still following me, his hooded head bowed slightly as he walked, but there were no footprints behind him. The snow remained, pristine, undisturbed. My legs felt weak, but I forced myself to keep moving, my pace quickening with every step. I reached my driveway, fumbling for my keys with trembling hands. My house was dark, the porch light burned out, and the shadows seemed deeper than usual. I didn't dare look back again. I unlocked the door, slipped inside, and slammed it shut, locking it behind me. For a moment, I leaned against the door, trying to catch my breath. My heart was pounding, my mind racing. I told myself it was over. I was inside, safe. But then I heard Ita, faint sound, like the crunch of snow, just outside the door. I peeked through the peephole, my hands shaking. The porch was empty. The snow in front of my house was smooth, untouched. No footprints, no sign of anyone. But the feeling of being watched was stronger now, almost suffocating. I turned on every light in the house, my fear growing with each shadow that flickered on the walls. I checked every lock, every window, convincing myself it was just my imagination. But, deep down, I knew something wasn't right. Hours passed. The house was silent, except for the faint hum of the heater. I tried to distract myself with a book, the television, anything to drown out the uneasy thoughts swirling in my head. But no matter what I did, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. And then I heard it. A soft tap. Then another. It came from the window in the living room, rhythmic and deliberate, like someone was gently rapping on the glass. My blood turned to ice. I didn't want to look, but I couldn't ignore it. Slowly, I turned my head. The window was empty. Nothing but the dark night and the faint reflection of the room behind me. But the tapping continued, louder now, insistent. It sounded like it was coming from inside the glass, not outside. I backed away, my heart pounding in my chest. The lights flickered, plunging the room into momentary darkness. When they came back on, I froze. He was standing in the corner of the room. The man from the street, his hood still covering his face. He didn't move, didn't speak. He just stood there, motionless, his presence filling the room with an unbearable weight. I opened my mouth to scream, but no sound came out. I blinked, and he was gone. The room was empty again, the shadows deep and oppressive. My chest heaved, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps. I stumbled toward the door, desperate to escape, but something stopped me. A voice. It was faint at first, barely a whisper, but it grew louder, filling my ears with a low, guttural tone. It didn't sound human. The words were impossible to understand, a language that made my head throb and my vision blur. The lights flickered again, and I felt a cold breath on the back of my neck. I turned, and he was there. Closer this time, just a few feet away. His hood had fallen back, revealing a face that wasn't a face at all. It was blank, smooth, as if someone had erased all his features. But the darkness, where his eyes should have been, stared into me, deep and endless. I stumbled back, tripping over the coffee table and falling to the floor. The voice grew louder, filling my head with a sound that was both deafening and silent. I closed my eyes, covering my ears, desperate to block it out. And then, everything stopped. The house was silent again. When I opened my eyes, the man was gone. The lights were steady, the room empty. But the air felt different, heavier, colder. I sat there for what felt like hours, afraid to move, afraid to breathe. Eventually, I got up and checked every corner of the house. There was no sign of him, no evidence that he had ever been there. But when I looked outside, the snow in my driveway was pared and still untouched, no footprints, not even mine. I don't know what followed me home that night, but it hasn't left. Shadows, in the flicker of the lights, in the quiet moments when I am alone. I know it's watching, waiting, and I know one day it will step out of the darkness again. The frost crept over everything that night, turning the world into a cold, glittering silence. The air was so frigid it felt like breathing glass, each exhale forming a soft white cloud that quickly disappeared. I had gone outside to check on the pipes, worried it'd freeze in the sudden drop of temperature. The cabin I was staying in was old and drafty, barely holding back the biting cold. The night was eerily quiet. No wind, no rustling of trees, not even the distant howl of an animal. Just the soft crackling of frost as it spread across the wooden porch and the ground around me. I stood there for a moment, the crunch of snow beneath my boots the only sound, as I inspected the lines leading to the well. Then I heard it. My name, whispered. It was faint, barely louder than the sound of the frost crackling in the stillness, but it was unmistakable, carried on the cold air as if the frost itself had spoken. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. The sound seemed to come from the woods, just beyond the clearing where the cabin stood. "Hello?" I called out, my voice trembling in the still air. Nothing, just the silence and the frost crackling around me. I told myself it was the wind, though there was none. Or maybe it was my imagination, the cold playing tricks on my mind. But I couldn't shake the feeling that someone or something was watching me. I turned back toward the cabin, eager to escape the freezing night. But as I took a step, I heard it again. My name, louder this time, more distinct. It wasn't a voice I recognized, but there was something unnervingly familiar about it, like a memory I couldn't quite place. Against my better judgment, I turned toward the woods. The trees stood like dark sentinels, their branches heavy with frost, glinting faintly in the moonlight. My breath quickened as I stepped closer to the edge of the clearing. The snow was untouched, pristine, yet the whisper had come from somewhere in those trees. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice shaking. No answer. But the whisper came again, closer now, as if it were right at the edge of the clearing. My name, drawn out, soft and lingering, like a secret. My skin prickled with unease, and I felt the urge to run, but I couldn't move. My feet seemed rooted to the ground. I stepped into the woods. The air grew colder immediately, the frost crackling louder with each step. The trees seemed close in around me, their branches intertwining above, blocking out the sky. The snow crunched beneath my boots, and I tried to convince myself that I was imagining things. But I couldn't ignore the whispers. They weren't just calling my name anymore. They were murmuring, low and unintelligible, like a conversation just out of earshot. The sound came from all around me, bouncing off the trees, impossible to pinpoint. I turned in a slow circle, my breath fogging in the air. "Show yourself," I shouted, my voice echoing through the forest. The whispers stopped. For a moment, there was only silence, the kind of silence that presses against your ears, heavy and suffocating. And then, I saw it. A figure, standing just beyond the nearest trees. It was pale, almost glowing in the dim light. Its shape was wrong. It was tall and thin, its limbs too long, its head tilted at an unnatural angle. It didn't move, didn't make a sound. It just stood there, watching me. My heart pounded in my chest as I stumbled back, my legs trembling. The frost crackled louder, and the whispers started again, overlapping and growing more insistent. The figure stepped closer, its movements slow and deliberate, the snow beneath it undisturbed. "Stay back," I shouted, my voice breaking. It didn't stop. It raised one impossibly long arm, pointing at me. The whispers rose to a crescendo, drowning out my thoughts, filling my head with a suffocating pressure. I turned and ran, my feet slipping on the icy ground, the branches clawing at my coat as I fled. The frost crackled louder with every step, the whispers chasing me through the trees. My lungs burned from the cold air, my legs screaming in protest, but I didn't dare stop. I could feel it, behind me, its presence heavy and suffocating, the frost spreading faster as it closed in. I burst out of the woods and into the clearing, the cabin a beacon in the darkness. The door was open, the warm light spilling out onto the snow. I stumbled inside, slamming the door shut, locking it behind me. My chest heaved as I pressed my back against the wood, my ears straining for any sound outside. Silence. For a moment, I thought I was safe. The warmth of the cabin began to thaw my frozen limbs. I tried to steady my breathing, but then I heard it again. The whisper. Inside the cabin. I turned slowly, my heart in my throat. The room was empty, just as I had left it. The fire crackled in the hearth, casting flickering shadows on the walls. But the frost was spreading across the windows, creeping inward, and the whispers grew louder, coming from everywhere and nowhere. The lights flickered, and the fire sputtered, plunging the room into darkness. I fumbled for my flashlight, my hands trembling, and when I turned it on, the beam fell on the figure. It was inside. It stood in the corner of the room, its pale form towering over the furniture, its head tilted, and, for the first time, it spoke, not in a whisper, but in a voice that was mine. "You shouldn't have come." The frost surged forward, crawling across the floor, the walls, the ceiling, encasing everything in its icy grip. The flashlight flickered, and the last thing I saw was the figure's blank, expressionless face as it moved toward me. And then, everything went cold. When I woke up, the cabin was gone. The woods were silent, the frost gone from the trees, snow undisturbed. But the whispers lingered, faint and distant, calling my name from the shadows, and I knew they would never stop. The snowfall was heavy that morning, blanketing everything in a thick, pristine layer of white. I had woken up to the sound of snowplows in the distance and decided to take a walk through the neighborhood before the roads became too slushy. The world felt quiet and untouched, muffled by the snow, with only the crunch of my boots to keep me company. As I walked past rows of houses and their snow-covered yards, I felt a strange sense of calm. Winter always had that effect on me. Everything slowed down, even time itself. But as I rounded the corner toward the small park at the edge of the neighborhood, began to fade. In the middle of the park stood a snowman. At first it seemed ordinary, a classic figure made of 3 uneven snowballs, stacked atop one another, a crooked stick for an arm, and a carrot for a nose. What struck me as odd was the scarf. It was wrapped snugly around the snowman's neck, a familiar shade of deep red with frayed edges. My scarf, the one I had lost a week ago. I stopped in my tracks, staring at it. I was sure it was mine. The distinct tear near one end and the faded embroidery were unmistakable. But how could it have ended up here? I had lost it during a planin walk home from work, miles away from the park. A chill prickled at the back of my neck, but I brushed it off. It's just a coincidence, I told myself. Someone must have found it and decided to use it for the snowman. Still, I couldn't shake the unease creeping over me as I approached. The snowman looked crudely made, as though it had been built hastily. Its stick arms were uneven, one jutting out at an awkward angle, the other pointing straight up. The eyes, 2 smooth stones, seemed to stare directly at me. I laughed nervously, trying to dispel the feeling of being watched. I reached out and touched the scarf, confirming what I already knew. It was mine. The fabric was damp and cold, but unmistakably familiar. I considered taking it back, but something about the snowman made me hesitate. Its empty gaze felt almost expectant, like it was daring me to do something. I stepped back, shaking my head. It was ridiculous to feel unnerved by a snowman, yet I couldn't bring myself to touch it again. I decided to leave it alone and head home. The scarf wasn't worth whatever strange feeling had settled in my chest. But as I turned to go, I heard it. A faint crunch of snow behind me. I froze. The park was empty. I had been alone when I arrived. Slowly, I turned back toward the snowman. It hadn't moved. Of course, it hadn't moved. Snow don't move. But the snow around it, previously undisturbed now, had faint impressions, as though someone had been walking in circles around it. My breath caught in my throat, and I took it back. The wind picked up, carrying a soft, whispering sound through the park. At first, I thought it was just the breeze, but then I realized the sound wasn't random. It was rhythmic, deliberate, almost like breathing. It started on a cold, quiet evening. The sun had set hours ago, and the streets were empty as I walked home from the bus stop. The air was bitterly cold, my breath visible in the dim light of the street lamps. The snow crunched under my boots, the sound oddly loud in the stillness. I had taken this route hundreds of times before, but something felt different that night. The neighborhood seemed too quiet, as if the usual hum of distant traffic and muffled conversations had been swallowed by the cold. I told myself it was just my imagination, the winter air playing tricks on me. That's when I noticed him. At first, I thought he was just another pedestrian, a man, tall and thin, walking a few steps behind me. He wore a dark coat, his face obscured by the shadow of his hood. I wouldn't have given him a second thought if it weren't for the way he moved slow, deliberate, as if he were pacing himself to match my steps. I quickened my pace, my boots crunching faster against the snow. I didn't want to look back, but I couldn't help myself. I glanced over my shoulder. He was still there, the distance between us unchanged. My heart started to race. Maybe he was just heading in the same direction. Maybe I was overreacting, but I couldn't shake the unease creeping up my spine. I turned down a side street, my house just a few blocks away. The snow here was fresh, touched, and my footprints were the only ones on the ground, except his. I glanced back again, my breath catching in my throat. He was still following me, his hooded head bowed slightly as he walked, but there were no footprints behind him. The snow remained, pristine, undisturbed. My legs felt weak, but I forced myself to keep moving, my pace quickening with every step. I reached my driveway, fumbling for my keys with trembling hands. My house was dark, the porch light burned out, and the shadows seemed deeper than usual. I didn't dare look back again. I unlocked the door, slipped inside, and slammed it shut, locking it behind me. For a moment, I leaned against the door, trying to catch my breath. My heart was pounding, my mind racing. I told myself it was over. I was inside, safe. But then I heard Ita, faint sound, like the crunch of snow, just outside the door. I peeked through the peephole, my hands shaking. The porch was empty. The snow in front of my house was smooth, untouched. No footprints, no sign of anyone. But the feeling of being watched was stronger now, almost suffocating. I turned on every light in the house, my fear growing with each shadow that flickered on the walls. I checked every lock, every window, convincing myself it was just my imagination. But, deep down, I knew something wasn't right. The first night, everything seemed normal. I had checked into the hotel late after a long day of driving. The front desk clerk barely looked up as she handed me the key to room 213. The building was old, with worn carpets and walls that smelled faintly of mildew, but I was too tired to care. I just wanted to sleep. The room was small but clean. A single bed with a faded floral comforter, a desk with a cracked lamp, and a television that buzzed faintly even when it was off. I dropped my bag on the floor, kicked off my shoes, and collapsed onto the bed. The mattress was hard, and the pillow felt like a sack of lumpy cotton, but I didn't have the energy to complain. Sleep almost immediately. When I woke up the next morning, I noticed something odd. The wallpaper was different. It had been floral last night, but now it was striped, running vertically, in alternating shades of beige and green. I frowned, trying to convince myself that I must have been mistaken. Maybe I hadn't looked closely enough when I arrived. It wasn't worth worrying about. I checked out of habit to see if my bag was still where I had left it. It was, but it felt slightly off. The zipper, I realized, was facing the opposite direction. Strange, but maybe I had turned it without noticing. Shrugging off the unease, I grabbed my things and left to continue my trip. The second night, I came back to the same room. It was late again, and the desk clerk didn't even glance up this time. I trudged to room 213, unlocked the door, and stepped inside. It wasn't the same room. The bed was now pushed against the opposite wall. The desk had moved, and the cracked lamp was gone, replaced by a small metal one with a dim, flickering bulb. The television sat in the same corner, but the buzzing was louder now, like a swarm of bees trapped behind the screen. The wallpaper had changed again, a dull gray with faint, swirling patterns that seemed to shift when I wasn't looking directly at them. I stood in the doorway for a long moment, my heart pounding. Had the staff moved my things and redecorated while I was gone? Why? The idea made no sense. I checked my bag. It was still there, right where I had left it, but the zipper was facing the other way again. My clothes were folded differently too, not the way I had packed them. Maybe I am just tired, I muttered to myself. Maybe I didn't notice. I tried to sleep, but the faint flickering of the bulb and the buzz of the television made it impossible to relax. Around midnight, I thought I heard faint scratching sounds coming from the tin walls. When I pressed my ear against the wallpaper, the sound stopped, but I could swear I felt something moving just beneath the surface. The third night was worse. I had planned to leave the hotel that morning, but heavy snow had started falling, and the roads were impassable. The clerk at the desk said there were no refunds for early departures, so I reluctantly agreed to stay another night. When I entered room 213, I immediately felt my stomach drop. The room had changed again. This time, the bed was gone, replaced by a worn-out sofa pushed against the far wall. A single, flickering light bulb hung from the ceiling, casting long, shifting shadows. The television was gone entirely, and in its place was an old wooden rocking chair. The air felt damp, and the wall snow, a pale yellow streaked with dark stains, looked disturbingly like handprints. I stepped inside cautiously, every instinct telling me to leave, but the snowstorm outside was unforgiving. I checked my bag. It was there, but all the contents were rearranged again. I hadn't touched them since the night before. My heart raced as I sat on the sofa, the damp fabric clinging to my skin. The scratching from the previous night returned, louder and more insistent. It wasn't just the walls this time. It was the floor, the ceiling, everywhere. I tried to drown it out with the sound of my breathing, but it grew louder, closer. The shadows cast by the hanging bulb began to stretch, unnaturally, curling and twisting across the walls like fingers reaching for me. I didn't sleep that night. The fourth night, I tried to switch rooms. The clerk at the desk finally looked up at me, her face pale and her expression unreadable. "I am sorry," she said, her voice flat and emotionless. "Room 213 is the only one available." I wanted to argue, but something in her tone stopped me. I trudged back up the stairs, dread settling deep in my chest as I unlocked the door. The room was unrecognizable now. The walls were bare, the wallpaper stripped away to reveal rotting wood beneath. The light bulb flickered once before going out entirely, leaving me in near total darkness. The only source of light was a faint glow coming from a narrow crack in the far wall. It pulsed softly, like a heartbeat, casting faint, shifting shadows across the room. My bag was still there, but its contents had been scattered across the floor. Items I didn't recognize were mixed in photographs of places I had never been. A watch that wasn't mine, a small, rusted key. The scratching was constant now, growing louder and more frantic. I could feel it beneath my feet, like something was trying to claw its way up from below. The shadows moved in ways that defied logic, stretching and bending as though they had a life of their own. Then I heard the voice. It was faint at first, a low whisper coming from the crack in the wall. It spoke my name, over and over, growing louder with each repetition. My heart raced as I backed toward the door, but the knob wouldn't turn. I was trapped. The whisper turned into a chorus of voices, overlapping, echoing, filling the room until it felt like my skull would split open. The light from the crack grew brighter, and I could see something moving behind it, something that didn't belong in this world. I don't know how I got out. The next thing I remember, I was standing outside in the snow, the cold biting at my skin. The hotel loomed behind me, dark and silent, the windows like empty eyes staring down. I ran, my breath fogging in the air, my footsteps crunching through the snow until I reached my car. I didn't look back. I never found out what happened in that room, but I still dream about it. The whispers, the shadows, the glowing crack in the wall, they haunt me, even now. And sometimes, when I wake, up in the middle of the night, I swear I can hear the faint sound of scratching, coming from just beneath the floorboards. The frost had crept over the windows that night, turning them into opaque sheets of swirling, white patterns. The snowstorm outside howled like a living thing, the wind battering the walls of my old cabin. I sat by the fireplace, the only source of warmth in the cold, lonely room, sipping a cup of tea that had gone lukewarm. The storm had started hours earlier, and the world outside was completely obscured. The windows, frosted and fogged, gave no hint of what lay beyond them. The only sounds were the crackling of the fire and the occasional groan of the wind, forcing its way through unseen gaps in the walls. It was the kind of night that made you feel utterly alone. I had been staring into the flames, lost in thought, when a sudden noise broke through the flames, stillness, a faint tapping, like someone lightly rapping their knuckles on glass. My heart skipped a beat as I turned toward the window. The sound came again, deliberate and slow. Tap, tap, tap. I stood, my mug trembling in my hand, and stepped closer to the window. The frost-covered glass distorted everything beyond it, but I could see no shape or movement. The tapping stopped as soon as I approached, leaving only the sound of my own breathing. "It's just the storm," I whispered to myself, though the unease curling in my stomach told me otherwise. I pressed my palm against the cold glass, squinting, trying to peer through the frost. The storm outside was relentless, snow whipping through the air in a frenzy. But then, in the faint glow of the porch light, I saw it. A face. It was barely visible through the frosted patterns, but it was unmistakable. A pale, shadowy figure stood just beyond the window, its features distorted but chillingly human. Dark, hollow, eyes stared directly at me, and a thin, unnatural smile stretched across its face. I stumbled back, my mug slipping from my hand and shattering on the floor. My heart thundered in my chest as I stared at the window, frozen in place. The figure didn't move. It just stood there, watching, its breath fogging the glass from the outside. "Who's there?" I managed to choke out, my voice trembling. No response. The storm roared louder, as if to drown out my words. I grabbed a flashlight from the nearby table and turned it on, aiming the beam at the window. The light pierced through the frost, illuminating the porch beyond. It was empty. I blinked, my breath catching in my throat. The face was gone, the space outside the window, void of any trace of the figure. Snow continued to swirl in the wind, but there were no footprints on the porch, no sign that anyone had been there. I tried to calm myself, telling myself it was just a trick of the frost, my mind playing games in the isolation of the storm. But I couldn't shake the image of those hollow eyes and that twisted smile. I locked the front door, double-checking the deadbolt, and returned to the fireplace, trying to push the encounter from my mind. But the tapping came again. This time it was louder, more insistent, coming from the side window near the kitchen. Tap, tap. My stomach twisted as I turned toward the sound. The frost-covered glass revealed nothing but swirling patterns and shadows. The tapping didn't stop. It echoed through the cabin, relentless and deliberate. My hands trembled as I approached the window, the flashlight shaking in my grip. I shone the beam at the glass, but it revealed nothing beyond the frost. "Go away," I shouted, my voice cracking. The tapping ceased instantly, replaced by an eerie silence. The only sound was the faint crackle of the fire, which seemed impossibly far away. My pulse pounded in my ears as I backed away from the window, my eyes darting to every corner of the room. And then I saw it again. The face appeared at the window near the front door, clearer this time, its features pressing against the glass. The hollow eyes seemed to bore into me, and the smile widened, revealing rows of jagged teeth that didn't belong on any human. My breath hitched as the figure slowly tilted its head, as if studying me. I bolted for the door, throwing it open and stepping out into the storm. The cold hit me like a wall, but I didn't care. I had to see what was out there. My flashlight beam swept across the porch and the snow-covered ground beyond. Nothing. No footprints. No sign of any having been there. The snow was untouched, pristine except for my own tracks. The storm whipped around me, the wind howling in my ears, but the world was empty. I stood there, shivering, the flashlight beam trembling in my hand. I didn't understand. How? Could it have been right there, just inches from the glass, and leave no trace? My mind raced with possibilities, each one more unsettling than the last. Then, from behind me, I heard the faintest whisper. My name. I spun around, shining the flashlight back at the cabin. The windows glowed faintly from the firelight within, and in the frost of the front window, the face stared back at me, more defined than ever. It wasn't outside anymore. It was inside. I dropped the flashlight and ran, the snow swallowing the sound of my footsteps as I fled into the storm. The cold burned my lungs, and the wind tore at my coat, but I didn't stop. I didn't look. Back. The cabin disappeared into the blizzard, swallowed by the darkness and snow. I don't know how long I ran before I found the road. A passing plow driver picked me up, his face full of confusion as I babbled about the figure in the window. He didn't believe me. Of course. Who would? But I know what I saw. Even now, I can still feel those eyes on me, watching, waiting, and sometimes, late at night, when the frost creeps over my windows, I hear it again. The faint tapping, the sound of my name whispered in the icy air, and I know it's still out there, waiting for me to come back. The snow had been falling all morning, blanketing the world in a silent stillness. I had gone for a walk through the woods near my house, eager to enjoy the peaceful beauty of winter. The trees were heavy with snow, their branches bowing under the weight, and my boots crunched softly on the unbroken path. It wasn't until I reached a small clearing that I noticed something unusual. There, lying on the pristine snow, was a photograph. At first, I thought it was just a piece of trash someone had dropped, but something about it caught my attention. The edges were slightly curled, and the surface dusted with a thin layer of frost, yet it didn't look like it had been there long. I knelt down and picked it up, brushing off the snow. It was a picture of me. I stared at it, my breath forming small clouds in the cold air. The photo was old, faded, and yellowed, but there was no mistaking it. It was me wearing the same red scarf I had lost weeks ago, standing in a place I didn't recognize. Behind me in the photo was a forest, but it wasn't the woods near my house. The trees were darker, twisted, and gnarled, their shapes unnatural and unsettling. I turned the photo over. The back was blank except for a single line written in smudged, shaky handwriting. A chill ran down my spine, colder than the winter air. I looked around the clearing, half expecting to see someone watching me, but I was alone. The snow was undisturbed, except for my own footprints leading to the spot where I had found the photo. Who left this here? I whispered to myself, my voice barely audible in the silence. I should have left it there. I should have turned back and gone home. But curiosity mixed with a growing sense of unease compelled me to stay. I slipped the photo into my pocket and continued walking, my eyes scanning the trees for any sign of movement. As I walked deeper into the woods, the atmosphere began to change. The air grew colder, heavier, and the silence became oppressive. The snow underfoot seemed darker, as though shadows had seeped into it, and the trees around me twisted unnaturally, their branches reaching like skeletal fingers. That's when I noticed the footprints. They appeared out of nowhere, a single trail of prints in the snow leading off the path and deeper into the woods. They weren't mine. I hadn't veered off the trayland. They were too small to belong to an adult. They looked like the footprints of a child. I hesitated. Something about the prints felt wrong. They were too perfect, too precise, as though they had been placed there intentionally. And yet, I found myself following them, each step filling me with a mix of dread and curiosity. The footprints led me to another clearing. In the center stood an old, dilapidated cabin, its roof sagging under the weight of the snow. The windows were frosted over, and the door hung, slightly ajar, creaking softly in the wind. The footprints at the cabin's threshold, disappearing into the darkness inside. I didn't want to go in. Every instinct screamed at me to turn back, to run, but something was pulling me forward. The photograph in my pocket felt heavier, almost as if it was urging me to take the next step. I pushed the door open. The air inside was stale and freezing, carrying the faint scent of decay. The room was dim, lit only by the pale light filtering through the frosted windows. Furniture was scattered, haphazardly an old chair missing a leg, a table covered in dust and cobwebs, and a mirror hanging crooked on the far wall. And then I saw it, another photograph. It was lying on the table, untouched by dust or time. My hands trembled as I picked it up. It was another picture of me, but this time, I was standing outside the very cabin I was in now. The same red scarf was wrapped around my neck, and my expression was blank, almost vacant, as I stared directly into the camera. The same message was written on the back. "Come find me." I dropped the photo, my heart racing. This wasn't possible. In these pictures, how had they known I would come here? My breathing quickened as I scanned the room, my eyes darting to every corner. The shadows seemed to shift and move, growing darker and more oppressive. And then I heard it, a faint sound, like the crunch of snow just outside the cabin. My stomach twisted as I realized I wasn't alone. Slowly, I moved to the window and wiped away a patch of frost. Peering out into the clearing, there was no one there. But then I saw another photograph, lying in the snow just beyond the porch. My breath hitched as I opened the door and stepped outside, the cold biting at my skin. The photo was identical to the others. Me, staring blankly at the camera. But this time, the background was somewhere new. A dark, twisted forest, even more alien and unfamiliar than the woods I stood in. Now, the message on the back was different this time. "You are almost there." A sharp crack broke the silence, like a branch snapping underfoot. I spun around, but there was nothing, just the same empty clearing, and the cabin behind me. The snow around me was undisturbed, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. My pulse pounded in my ears as I turned back to the photograph. The forest in the picture felt familiar in a way I couldn't explain. It was as if I had been there before, though I knew I hadn't. My hands trembled as I folded the photo and placed it in my pocket, the weight of it pressing against me like a stone. I didn't stay to find out what would happen next. I ran, my slipping on the snow as I fled, the cabin and the clearing. The woods seemed darker, the shadows closing in around me as the storm picked up. By the time I reached the edge of the forest, my breath was ragged and my legs felt like lead. When I finally reached the safety of my home, I locked the door and bolted every window, threw the photographs into the fireplace, watching as the flames consumed them. But even as they burned, I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't over. The next morning, I found another photograph on my doorstep. It was me, standing in my living room, staring out the window. And on the back, a single line: "I found you." It was late, and the world outside my window was quiet, save for the occasional sound of a car passing on the distant road. I sat on the couch, scrolling through my phone mindlessly, trying to stave off the creeping unease that had settled over me for no particular reason. The house felt too silent, too still, and I told myself it was just my imagination playing tricks on me. After a while, I decided to put my phone away and call it a night. I slipped it into the pocket of my jeans, stretched, and stood to head to bed. That's when it happened. My phone buzzed. At first, I thought it was a notification. I reached into my pocket to check, but as I pulled it out, my heart stopped. The screen showed an incoming call from my own number. I stared at it, frozen, my mind racing for an explanation. A glitch? A prank? But how? My name flashed on the screen, Along with my own contact photo, a picture I didn't remember taking was just a blank black square. My thumb hovered over the decline button, but something compelled me to answer. I pressed the green icon and brought the phone to my ear, my heart pounding. "Hello?" I said, my voice trembling. At first, there was nothing but static, faint and crackling. Then, a voice. My voice. "Hello?" it said, mimicking me perfectly. A chill ran down my spine. "Who is this?" I demanded, trying to sound braver than I felt. The static grew louder, and the voice repeated my question, mocking my tone. "Who is this?" It sounded distorted now, warped and unnatural, like a recording played backward. Then, it left a hollow, cold sound that made my blood run cold. I pulled the phone away from my ear, my hand trembling. The call was still connected, the timer ticking up on the screen. I pressed the end button, but nothing happened. The call wouldn't disconnect. I held the power button, trying to force a restart, but the screen stayed frozen, locked on the call. The voice returned, louder this time, its tone dark and menacing. "Why did you hang up?" It asked. I dropped the phone in panic. It landed on the coffee table with a dull thud, the voice still emanating from the speaker. I backed away, my pulse racing, and stared at it, as though it were a venomous creature. Then, the lights flickered. The entire room plunged into darkness for a split second, before the lights came back on, dimmer than before. Shadows seemed to stretch unnaturally across the walls, their edges sharp, shifting. The phone continued to buzz, the voice laughing again, a sound that felt like it was crawling into my ears. I grabbed the phone, desperate to silence it, and hurled it against the wall. The screen cracked, with a loud snap, and the voice stopped abruptly. The silence that followed was deafening. For a moment, I stood there, my chest heaving, staring at the shattered phone on the floor. Relief started to wash over me until I heard it, a faint buzzing sound. I turned slowly toward the kitchen, where the sound was coming from. My heart sank as I saw the landline phone I hadn't used in years lit up, its receiver vibrating slightly. I hadn't even known it was plugged in. The caller ID displayed my number. The buzzing stopped, replaced by the ringing of the doorbell. I froze, every muscle in my body tense. Who would be at my door this late? Slowly, I crept toward the front window and peeked through the curtain. The porch was empty. No one was there. The doorbell rang again, more insistent this time. My breath came in short gasps as I approached the door, my hand trembling as I reached for the peephole. When I looked through, my blood turned to ice. It was me, or at least, something that looked like me. The figure on the porch wore my clothes, had my face, but its expression was wrong. Its eyes were empty, cold, and its smile stretched too wide, revealing teeth that didn't look quite human. It raised a hand and waved slowly, deliberately, as though it knew I was watching. The voice from the phone echoed in my ears, even though the room was silent now. "Why did you hang up?" The lights flickered again, plunging the house into darkness. When they came back on, the figure was gone. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in the corner of the room, every light in the house turned on, clutching a kitchen knife, waiting for something to happen. But the hours dragged on, and the house remained silent. The next morning, the storm of the night before felt like a distant nightmare. The shattered phone was still on the floor, and the landline sat eerily quiet on the counter. I dared to check the front porch, half expecting to find some sign of the figure I'd seen. But there was nothing, no footprints in the snow, no sign that anyone had been there at all. I told myself it was over, just a bizarre, unexplainable glitch. But I know that's not true, because sometimes, late at night, I hear my phone buzz. And when I check, here is no call. No message, just my reflection in the darkened screen, smiling back at me. The smell of smoke pulled me from a deep sleep, sharp and acrid. My eyes snapped open, my heart pounding as my brain scrambled to make sense of what was happening. The room was dark, except for the faint orange glow of my alarm clock. 3:17 a.m. The smell was stronger now, filling my nostrils and making my throat burn. My first thought was fire. I shot out of bed, adrenaline surging through my veins, and flipped on the light. The room looked normal, no flames, no visible smoke, but the smell lingered, heavy and suffocating, as if something was smoldering just out of sight. I checked the outlets first, running my hands along the walls to feel for heat. Nothing. I moved to the hallway, my bare feet padding softly on the wooden floor. The smell was stronger out there, clinging to the air like an invisible fog. My eyes darted around, searching for any sign of a spark, a glow, anything that could explain it. The kitchen was empty, the stove off, the counters clean. I moved to the living room, where the smell was nearly overpowering. I stopped in my tracks, my chest tightening. It wasn't just smoke, it was something else, something darker. It smelled like wood, and something sweet, like decay. I froze as a faint noise broke the silence. A creak, low and deliberate, coming from upstairs. My blood ran cold. I lived alone. Hello? My voice trembled, barely above a whisper. The house was silent again, the kind of silence that presses against your ears. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, my ears straining for any sound. The smell grew stronger, and the air felt heavier, almost oppressive, like the house itself was holding its breath. I grabbed a flashlight from the counter, my hands trembling, and made my way to the stairs. Each step groaned under my weight, the sound echoing through the stillness. The smell intensified with every step, so thick now that it made my eyes water. At the top of the stairs, the hallway stretched out before me, dark and unfamiliar. The flashlight's beam wavered as I moved it from side to side, illuminating doors I had closed before going to bed. But now, one was slightly ajar. My bedroom. I had just come from there. I swallowed hard, my throat dry, and approached the door. The smell of smoke was suffocating now, and my pulse pounded in my ears. I pushed the door open slowly, the hinges creaking loudly in the silence. The room was empty, exactly as I had left it. The bed was unmade, the lamp on the nightstand still glowing faintly. But the smell was strongest here, as if the source was somewhere inside the walls themselves. I turned in a slow circle, the flashlight casting eerie shadows on the walls. And then I saw it. On the floor near the foot of the bed was a single charred footprint. The outline was clear, blackened against the pale wood. My heart raced as I stared at it, unable to comprehend what I was seeing. It wasn't mine. I hadn't stepped there, and there was no reason for it to be burned into the floor. I stepped back, my legs shaking, and nearly tripped over something behind me. I spun around, the flashlight slipping from my hand and clattering to the ground. The beam flickered, illuminating a shape in the corner of the room. A figure. It was barely more than a shadow, its edges blurred and shifting, but its presence was undeniable. It stood completely still, its head tilted slightly as though watching me. My breath caught in my throat, and the air seemed to grow colder despite the heat of the smoke. Who are you? I stammered, my voice barely audible. The figure didn't move. The smell of smoke grew stronger, burning my lungs, and I coughed, doubling over. When I looked up again, the figure was gone. The corner was empty, the shadows still. I grabbed the flashlight and stumbled out of the room, my legs barely holding me up. I didn't stop until I was back downstairs, leaning against the counter, trying to catch my breath. Smell of smoke was fading now, replaced by the faint, familiar scent of my home. But my mind was racing, replaying the image of that burned footprint and the figure in the corner. I stayed awake until dawn, every creak of the house sending my heart racing. When the sunlight finally spilled through the windows, I forced myself to go back upstairs. The smell was gone, the air clear, and the room looked normal again, except for the footprint. It was still there, a blackened mark on the wooden floor that I couldn't explain. No matter how hard I scrubbed, it wouldn't fade. It was as though the wood itself had been scorched, burned into permanence. I don't know what I saw that night. I don't know where the smoke came from, or why it vanished. But sometimes, late at night, I catch a faint whiff of it again, smoke, and something sweet, lingering just long enough to make my chest tighten. And when I do, I can't help but glance at the corner of my room, half expecting to see that shadow again, watching me from the darkness. It was one of the coldest nights of the year, the kind where the air felt like shards of glass against your skin, and even the walls of the house seemed to groan under the weight of the chill. I had settled into my living room, wrapped in a blanket, watching the flames in the fireplace dance and crackle. The frost on the windows was thicker than usual, spreading in delicate, intricate patterns that glistened faintly in the dim light. It started with a feeling, a prickling at the back of my neck, as if someone were standing behind me. I turned, but of course, there was no one there. Just the flickering shadows cast by the firelight. I told myself it was nothing, just the eerie stillness of a winter night getting to me. But then I heard it. A faint, almost imperceptible sound, a soft creak, like the groan of wood under pressure. My eyes darted to the window. It was covered in frost, the paddling outward from the edges, but something about it felt off. The frost wasn't random anymore. It looked deliberate, almost as though it were forming shapes. I leaned forward, squinting, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. My breath fogged the air, and for a moment, I thought I was imagining it. But then, the shapes grew clearer. It was a face. The frost had formed a face in the center of the window, its features sharp and unmistakable. Eyes stared out at me, hollow and unblinking, framed by jagged lines of frost that seemed to mimic the contours of a skull. The mouth was open, frozen in what looked like a scream or a silent cry for help. I froze, my pulse pounding in my ears. It was impossible. Frost didn't do that. It didn't create faces. My rational mind scrambled for an explanation. Maybe it was some kind of trick of the cold, the way the patterns had formed. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. The face wasn't random. It was looking at me. I stood slowly, the blanket slipping from my shoulders. My breath came in short, shallow bursts, fogging the air as I approached the window. The closer I got, the clearer the face became. Eyes seemed to follow me, their gaze unrelenting and cold. The mouth, twisted and jagged, seemed to widen as I drew near. I reached out, my hand trembling, and touched the glass. The cold burned my fingertips, but I couldn't pull away. For a moment, everything was silent, except for the sound of my own breathing, and then the frost moved. It was subtle at first, just a faint shift in the patterns around the edges of the face. But then, the eyes blinked. I stumbled back, my heart hammering in my chest. The face pressed closer to the glass, as though it were trying to push through, its features distorting and shifting with the frost. I grabbed the fireplace poker, my hands shaking, and pointed it at the window as though it could protect me. "What do you want?" I whispered, my voice cracking. The frost didn't answer, but the face changed. The hollow eyes narrowed, and the mouth twisted into a gryna, jagged, cruel expression that sent a chill down my spine. The frost began to spread, crawling outward across the window pane, the lines of its grin growing wider. And then, the glass cracked. A thin, spiderweb-like fracture spread across the face, the sound sharp and unnatural in the silent room. I screamed and stumbled back, clutching the poker like a lifeline. The frost pulsed once, the face shifting again, before the entire window pane shattered. I threw my arms up to shield myself from the shards, but none of them touched me. When I looked again, the frost was gone. The window was intact, unbroken, as if nothing had happened. But the room was freezing, and the air carried a faint, bitter chill that bit at my skin. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, staring at the glass, waiting for something else to happen. But the frost didn't return, and the face didn't reappear. The only sound was the faint crackle of the dying fire behind me. I didn't sleep that night. I sat by the fireplace, every light in the house turned on, my eyes flicking to the windows at the slightest sound. The frost came back, but it was normal again, just random swirling patterns that meant nothing. But every now and then, in the dead of night, I swear I can feel it watching me. And when I look at the windows, I can almost make out the faint outline of a face, just waiting for the frost to form again. At first, I wasn't sure why. The house was dark and silent, the kind of silence that presses against your ears. I lay there, listening, when I heard a faint creak, like a floorboard shifting under weight. My chest tightened, and I held my breath, straining to hear. The sound came again, closer this time. Someone was inside the house. I sat up slowly, my body tense, my mind racing. The stairs creaked faintly, one by one, as if someone was climbing them deliberately, slowly. My bedroom door was closed, but I could feel the presence on the other side. My heart pounded so loudly, for whoever it was could hear it. The footsteps stopped just outside my door. I reached for my phone on the nightstand, but my fingers trembled so badly I nearly dropped it. I fumbled to unlock it, my eyes darting between the door and the screen. Before I could dial, a soft knock sounded, the same gentle tap I had heard earlier. "Who's there?" I whispered, my voice barely audible. No answer. The doorknob turned slowly, the metallic click echoing in the stillness. I couldn't move, frozen, in place as the door creaked open, revealing nothing but darkness. My breath hitched as I stared into the empty hallway. The light from the street lamp outside cast faint shadows across the floor, but there was no one there. I grabbed the lamp from my nightstand, holding it like a weapon, and stepped toward the door. My legs felt weak, my body screaming at me to turn back, but I had to know. I leaned into the pin hallway, my pulse racing. The footprints were there, wet prints, leading from the front door, up the stairs, and stopping just outside my room. But the trail didn't end. It turned, leading into the room across the hall, the guest room. The door was slightly ajar, and the darkness inside felt impossibly deep. I stared at the door, every nerve in my body on edge. The silence was deafening, the air heavy, with something I couldn't name. Slowly, I reached out, pushing the door open. The room was empty, the window shut, but the footprints stopped in the middle of the floor. And then, behind me, I heard a faint rasping breath. I turned, my blood running cold. The hallway was empty, but I could feel something was there, watching me, just out of sight. The air grew colder, and my vision blurred as my body went rigid with fear. I ran. I didn't stop to grab anything, didn't care about the cold or the snow outside. I just ran, the sound of my own footsteps echoing in my ears as I fled into the night. When I finally looked back, the house stood silent and dark, its windows like empty eyes staring back at me. I never went back. But sometimes, late at night, I still hear that knock, a soft, deliberate tap, as though it's reminding me that it knows where I am. And no matter where I go, I see them, footprints leading up to my door, but none leaving. At first, I wasn't sure why. The house was dark and silent, the kind of silence that presses against your ears. I lay there, listening, when I heard a faint creak, like a floorboard shifting under weight. My chest tightened, and I held my breath, straining to hear. The sound came again, closer this time. Someone was inside the house. I sat up slowly, my body tense, my mind racing. The stairs creaked faintly, one by one, as if someone was climbing them deliberately, slowly. My bedroom door was closed, but I could feel the presence on the other side. My heart pounded so loudly, for whoever it was could hear it. The footsteps stopped just outside my door. I reached for my phone on the nightstand, but my fingers trembled so badly I nearly dropped it. I fumbled to unlock it, my eyes darting between the door and the screen. Before I could dial, a soft knock sounded, the same gentle tap I had heard earlier. "Who's there?" I whispered, my voice barely audible. No answer. The doorknob turned slowly, the metallic click echoing in the stillness. I couldn't move, frozen, in place as the door creaked open, revealing nothing but darkness. My breath hitched as I stared into the empty hallway. The light from the street lamp outside cast faint shadows across the floor, but there was no one there. I grabbed the lamp from my nightstand, holding it like a weapon, and stepped toward the door. My legs felt weak, my body screaming at me to turn back, but I had to know. I leaned into the hallway, my pulse racing. The footprints were there, Wet prints, leading from the front door, up the stairs, and stopping just outside my room. But the trail didn't end. It turned, leading into the room across the hall, the guest room. The door was slightly ajar, and the darkness inside felt impossibly deep. I stared at the door, every nerve in my body on edge. The silence was deafening, the air heavy, with something I couldn't name. Slowly, I reached out, pushing the door open. The room was empty, the window shut, but the footprints stopped in the middle of the floor. And then, behind me, I heard a faint rasping breath. I turned, my blood running cold. The hallway was empty, but I could feel it. Something was there, watching me, just out of sight. The air grew colder, and my vision blurred as my body went rigid with fear. I ran. I didn't stop to grab anything, didn't care about the cold or the snow outside. I just ran, the sound of my own footsteps echoing in my ears as I fled into the night. When I finally looked back, the house stood silent and dark, its windows like empty eyes staring back at me. I never went back. But sometimes, late at night, I still hear that knock, a soft, deliberate tap, as though it's reminding me that it knows where I am. And no matter where I go, I see them, footprints leading up to my door, but none leaving. It was late afternoon when I found the frozen pond. The snow-covered trees surrounded it like a silent audience, their branches heavy with ice. The world was quiet except for the crunch of my boots on the snow. I had wandered further into the woods than I meant to, trying to escape the noise of daily life. The stillness was calming, almost hypnotic. The pond was perfectly still, its surface a sheet of dark, flawless ice. The light from the setting sun cast an eerie glow, making the ice shimmer like glass. I stepped closer, peering down at my reflection. My breath fogged the air, and for a moment, everything felt peaceful. But then, something changed. My reflection moved. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light or the way the ice refracted my image. But as I stared, my reflection raised its hand and waved. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. I hadn't moved. My arms were by my sides, yet the reflection stared back at me, its face identical to mine, its hand slowly waving. "What?" I whispered, my voice trembling. The reflection tilted its head, mirroring my confusion, but its smile widened unnaturally too, or wide for any human face. I stumbled back, nearly slipping on the ice. My breath came in shallow, gasps as I tried to convince myself I was imagining things. But when I looked down again, the reflection was still there, still smiling, still waving. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice echoing across the empty woods. The reflection stopped waving and lowered its hand, its expression turning blank. Then, it took a step forward. The ice beneath my feet groaned. I jumped back, my heart racing, but my boots remained firm on the snowy bank. The reflection wasn't stepping closer to meet, was moving beneath the ice. Its feet didn't break through the surface. It moved smoothly, fluidly, as if the ice was water, and it was gliding effortlessly. "Stay back," I shouted, though my voice cracked with fear. It didn't listen. It kept moving, its head tilted slightly, its blank eyes locked onto mine. I backed away, the cold biting at my skin, but I couldn't tear my gaze away from the impossible figure below the ice. Then, it stopped. It stood directly beneath me, staring up with a smile that sent a chill down my spine. Slowly, it raised its hand again, pressing it against the underside of the ice. I could see the details of its palm, the lines and creases identical to mine, as if it were a perfect copy. My stomach churned as I realized what it was doing. It was knocking. A soft, deliberate tap, tap, tap echoed through the frozen pond, faint but unmistakable. The sound vibrated through the air, making my skin crawl. I stumbled further, my legs trembling, but the reflection didn't follow. It just stood there, its eyes boring into mine, its hands still pressed against the ice. I froze. His face was obscured by a hood, but what little I could see wasn't right. His skin was pale, almost translucent, and his eyes' dark, empty voids seemed to stare right through me. A twisted grin spread across his face, too wide, revealing jagged teeth that didn't belong to anything human. Panic surged through me, and I stumbled back, nearly losing my footing in the deep snow. Figure began to move again, but this time, he was coming toward me. His steps were slow, deliberate, but he seemed to cover the distance between us effortlessly. I turned and ran. The snow clawed at my legs, and the wind roared in my ears, but I didn't dare look back. Heart pounded as I pushed forward, desperate to put as much distance between us as possible. The trees around me seemed to close in, their skeletal branches reaching out like they wanted to pull me back. The storm grew worse, the wind screaming through the trees and the snow blinding me completely. I had no idea where I was going just away from him. My legs burned. My breath came in ragged gasps, but I couldn't stop. The sound of footsteps crunching in the snow followed. Me, steady and unrelenting. I tripped, falling hard onto the frozen ground. Pain shot through my knees and hands, but scrambled to my feet, gasping for air. The footsteps were closer now, and I could feel his presence behind me, cold and suffocating. "Leave me alone," I screamed, my voice barely audible over the storm. The wind seemed to answer, carrying a low, guttural laugh that sent chills down my spine. Stumbled forward, tears freezing on my cheeks as I fought to keep moving. The snow seemed endless, stretching on forever, and I began to wonder if I would ever find my way back. And then, I saw I'd a faint light in the distance. My chest tightened with hope. It had to be the cabin. I forced my legs to keep going, my body screaming in protest with every step. The light grew brighter, cutting through the storm like a beacon. I reached the clearing, collapsing onto my knees in front of the cabin door. The light from inside spilled onto the snow, warm and inviting. I fumbled for the doorknob, my fingers numb, and pushed it open. Inside, the warmth hit me like a wave. The fire crackled in the hearth, and the room was just as I had left it. I slammed the door shut, locking it behind me, and leaned against it, gasping for air. But something was wrong. The fire didn't feel warm. The air inside the cabin was still freezing, and my breath fogged in. Front of me, I looked around, my heart sinking, as I realized the room wasn't quite right. Furniture was the same, but everything felt off like a reflection in a broken mirror. And then I saw him. He was standing in the corner of the room, his dark, hollow eyes fixed on me. His grin widened as he took a step forward, and I realized with horror that I had never escaped the storm. I had followed him here, and now I was lost. "It's closer now. Don't stop. Don't let it catch you." I didn't want to believe it, but the sound came again closer this time. The crunch of snow behind me was deliberate, steady, as though whoever or whatever was following me wanted me to know it was there. Panic surged through me, and I started walking faster. My heart pounded in my chest as the footsteps grew louder, matching my pace. I broke into a run, the diary clutched tightly to my chest, the cold air burning my lungs. The trail twisted and turned, the trees looming over me like shadowy souls. I didn't know where I was going anymore. I just knew I had to get away. The footsteps behind me quickened, closing the distance, and I could feel its presence, heavy and suffocating. "Leave me alone!" I screamed, my voice echoing through the woods. The only response was the crunching of snow, relentless and unyielding. My legs burned, my breath coming in ragged gasps, but I couldn't stop. The diary's words flashed in my mind. "Don't stop. Don't let it catch you." Finally, I stumbled into a small clearing, the snow swirling around me in a chaotic frenzy. The footsteps stopped. The silence that followed was deafening, the air thick with an unnatural stillness. I turned the next page of the diary, desperate for answers. The entry was longer this time, the words scrawled with frantic urgency. "You've reached the clearing. It's here now. Don't let it take the diary. Whatever you do, don't let it take the diary." My breath caught in my throat as I read the words. I looked around the clearing, my pulse racing. The trees seemed to shift and move in the corner of my vision, their shadows stretching unnaturally, and then I saw it. A figure stood at the edge of the clearing, its form barely visible through the falling snow. It was tall and thin, its limbs unnaturally long, and its face was blank, a smooth expanse of pale skin with no features. It took a step forward, and the snow didn't crunch beneath its feet. It moved silently, as if it weren't part of this world. "Stay back," I shouted, my voice trembling. The figure didn't stop. It reached out, one skeletal hand stretching toward me, its movements slow and deliberate. I clutched the diary tighter, backing away, felt the bark of a tree against my back. The figure stopped, its blank face tilting slightly, as if studying me. The air grew colder, and my vision blurred as the edges of the clearing seemed to fade into darkness. The diary in my hands felt heavier, almost burning, as if it were alive. And then it spoke. Not with words, but with a voice that echoed inside my mind, cold and hollow. "It's time to give it back." I screamed and threw the diary as hard as I could. It landed in the snow, the pages fluttering open, as the figure moved toward it. The moment it touched the diary, the glow of its pale form dimmed, and the clearing was plunged into darkness. When I opened my eyes, I was lying on the trail, the snow falling softly around me. The diary was gone, and the clearing looked untouched, as if nothing had happened. But I could still feel its weight in my hands, its words etched into my mind. Even now, I dream of that clearing, of the figure waiting in the snow. And sometimes, when the wind howls outside my window, I swear I hear pages turning, as if the diary is calling me back. The snowstorm hit harder than I expected. What was supposed to be a relaxing weekend of skiing turned into a desperate search for shelter, as the wind howled and the snow came down in thick, blinding sheets. I could barely see a few feet ahead, my body aching from the cold and exhaustion. That's when I saw Ida Lodge, sitting at the base of the mountain, its lights glowing faintly through the storm. Relief flooded me as I stumbled toward it, my boots crunching in the deep snow. The building looked old, but it was warm and inviting compared to the freezing blizzard outside. I pushed through the heavy wooden door, the warmth hitting me like a wave. The lobby was cozy, with a roaring fireplace and plush chairs scattered around. The walls were lined with old photographs of skiers and snowy peaks, giving the place a rustic charm. I called out, "Hello? Is anyone here?" My voice echoed faintly, but there was no response. The front desk was empty. A small bell sat on the counter, and I tapped it, the sound sharp and jarring in the silence. Still, no one appeared. I was too tired to question it. There were keys hanging on the wall behind the desk, each labeled with a room number. After a moment of hesitation, I grabbed one marked 207 and made my way upstairs. The hallway was long and dimly lit, the wooden floor creaking under my boots. The air smelled faintly of pine and something else I couldn't quite place. The doors to the other rooms were all closed, but everything was unnervingly quiet. No voices, no footsteps, nothing. It was as though I was the only person in the entire lodge. When I reached my room, I unlocked the door and stepped inside. The room was simple but comfortable, a bed with a heavy quilt, a small table with a lamp, and a window that overlooked the snowy landscape. I peeled off my wet clothes, changed into dry ones, and collapsed onto the bed, exhaustion washing over me. But sleep didn't come easily. The silence of the lodge felt oppressive, almost unnatural. I kept straining to hear something, anything that would indicate another person was there. A laugh, a door creaking, even footsteps in the hallway. But there was nothing, just the faint sound of the wind outside. I tried to convince myself that the storm had scared everyone off, that I had arrived after the lodge had been closed for the night. Maybe the staff had gone home early. Maybe I really was alone. But something about the thought didn't sit right. Around midnight, I heard it, a faint creak, coming from the hallway. My breath caught in my throat as I sat up, straining to listen. The sound came again, slow and deliberate, as though someone was walking down the hall taking careful steps. I climbed out of bed, my bare feet sinking into the cold wooden floor. My heart pounded as I crept to the door and pressed my ear against it. The footsteps were closer now, stopping just outside my room. I held my breath, every muscle in my body tense. "Hello?" I whispered, my voice barely audible. There was no response, just the sound of the wind howling outside. Slowly, I turned the lock on the door and opened it a crack. The hallway was empty. My stomach churned as I stepped into the hall, glancing up and down its length. The dim lights flickered slightly, casting strange shadows on the walls. The lodge was silent again, as though nothing had happened. The snow was falling softly that afternoon, blanketing the ground in white. I had gone for a walk to clear my mind, the cold air biting at my cheeks as I followed the narrow trail through the woods. It was peaceful, quiet, with only the crunch of my boots breaking the stillness. The world felt distant, muffled by the snow, and I let my thoughts drift. That's when I saw it. A corner of something dark was sticking out of the snow just off the trail. It looked out of place, unnatural against the pristine white. Curiosity tugged at me. I knelt down, brushing away the snow with my gloved hands. My fingers trembled as I uncovered the objective book. Its cover, weathered and stained. My breath caught in my throat as I turned it over. It was my diary. I stared at it, confused and disoriented. It was impossible. I had lost this diary years ago, back when I was a teenager. It had vanished without a trace, and I had assumed it was gone forever. But now, here it was, buried in the snow in the middle of nowhere. My hands shook as I opened it, flipping through the pages. The writing was me, handwriting, my words. Memories came rushing back as I scanned the familiar entries, moments I had recorded years ago. But as I flipped further, something changed. The entries weren't mine anymore. The handwriting was the same, but the words, they described things I didn't remember. Places I had never been, people I didn't know. The dates didn't make sense either. Some of them were years into the future. My heart pounded as I read one of the entries. The 14th of January. The snow is falling heavier now. I found the diary today, just like I knew I would. It's watching me. I can feel it. I have to keep walking, even though I know where it leads. I dropped the diary, my breath coming in shallow gasps. My head spun as I tried to make sense of what I had just read. How could this be possible? How could it describe exactly what was happening right now? I should have left it there. I should have turned back and gone home. But something about the diary pulled at me, an invisible force I couldn't resist. I picked it up again, flipping to the next page. The entry was short, the words scrawled hastily. Don't look back. No matter what you hear, don't look back. A chill ran down my spine that had nothing to do with the cold. I stood up, clutching the diary tightly, and looked around. The woods were silent, the snow falling steadily, but I felt an overwhelming sense of being watched. I started walking, my boots crunching in the snow. The trail stretched on ahead of me, but it felt wrong now, darker, narrower, as if the trees were closing in. The air grew colder, biting at my skin even through my coat. I kept glancing over my shoulder, the words from the diary echoing in my mind. Don't look back. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the sound of my footsteps. But then, I heard Ida, faint crunching sound, like someone following me. I stopped, my breath fogging the air, and listened. The sound stopped too. The forest was silent again. I turned the next page of the diary, my hands trembling. The words were written in bold, shaky letters. It's closer now. Don't stop. Don't let it catch you. I didn't want to believe it, but the sound came again closer this time. The crunch of snow behind me was deliberate, steady, as though whoever or whatever was following me wanted me to know it was there. Panic surged through me, and I started walking faster. My heart pounded in my chest as the footsteps grew louder, matching my pace. I broke into a run, the diary clutched tightly to my chest, the cold air burning my lungs. The trail twisted and turned, the trees looming over me like shadowy souls. I didn't know where I was going anymore. I just knew I had to get away. The footsteps behind me quickened, closing the distance, and I could feel its presence, heavy and suffocating. "Leave me alone!" I screamed, my voice echoing through the woods. The only response was the crunching of snow, relentless and unyielding. My legs burned, my breath coming in ragged gasps, but I couldn't stop. The diary's words flashed in my mind. "Don't stop. Don't let it catch you." Finally, I stumbled into a small clearing, the snow swirling around me in a chaotic frenzy. The footsteps stopped. The silence that followed was deafening, the air thick with an unnatural stillness. I turned the next page of the diary, desperate for answers. The entry was longer this time. The words scrawled with frantic urgency. "You've reached the clearing. It's here now. Don't let it take the diary. Whatever you do, don't let it take the diary." My breath caught in my throat as I read the words. I looked around the clearing, my pulse racing. The trees seemed to shift and move in the corner of my vision, their shadows stretching unnaturally, and then I saw it. A figure stood at the edge of the clearing, its form barely visible through the falling snow. It was tall and thin, its limbs unnaturally long, and its face was blank, a smooth expanse of pale skin with no features. It took a step forward, and the snow didn't crunch beneath its feet. It moved silently, as if it weren't part of this world. "Stay back," I shouted, my voice trembling. The figure didn't stop. It reached out, one skeletal hand stretching toward me, its movements slow and deliberate. I clutched the diary tighter, backing away, felt the bark of a tree against my back. The figure stopped, its blank face tilting slightly, as if studying me. The air grew colder, and my vision blurred as the edges of the clearing seemed to fade into darkness. The diary in my hands felt heavier, almost burning, as if it were alive. And then it spoke, not with words, but with a voice that echoed inside my mind, cold and hollow. "It's time to give it back." I screamed and threw the diary as hard as I could. It landed in the snow, the pages fluttering open, as the figure moved toward it. The moment it touched the diary, the glow of its pale form dimmed, and the clearing was plunged into darkness. When I opened my eyes, I was lying on the trail, the snow falling softly around me. The diary was gone, and the clearing looked untouched, as if nothing had happened. But I could still feel its weight in my hands, its words etched into my mind. Even now, I dream of that clearing, of the figure waiting in the snow. And sometimes, when the wind howls outside my window, I swear I hear pages turning, as if the diary is calling me back. It was late afternoon when I found the frozen pond. The snow-covered trees surrounded it like a silent audience, their branches heavy with ice. The world was quiet except for the crunch of my boots on the snow. I had wandered further into the woods than I meant to, trying to escape the noise of daily life. The stillness was calming, almost hypnotic. The pond was perfectly still, its surface a sheet of dark, flawless ice. The light from the setting sun cast an eerie glow, making the ice shimmer like glass. I stepped closer, peering down at my reflection. My breath fogged the air, and for a moment, everything felt peaceful. But then, something changed. My reflection moved. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light or the way the ice refracted my image. But as I stared, my reflection raised its hand and waved. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. I hadn't moved. My arms were by my sides, yet the reflection stared back at me, its face identical to mine, its hand slowly waving. "What?" I whispered, my voice trembling. The reflection tilted its head, mirroring my confusion, but its smile widened unnaturally too, or wide for any human face. I stumbled back, nearly slipping on the ice. My breath came in shallow gasps as I tried to convince myself I was imagining things. But when I looked down again, the reflection was still there, still smiling, still waving. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice echoing across the empty woods. The reflection stopped waving and lowered its hand, its expression turning blank. Then, it took a step forward. The ice beneath my feet groaned. I jumped back, my heart racing, but my boots remained firmly on the snowy bank. The reflection wasn't stepping closer to meet, was moving beneath the ice. Its feet didn't break through the surface. It moved smoothly, fluidly, as if the ice was water, and it was gliding effortlessly. "Stay back," I shouted, though my voice cracked with fear. It didn't listen. It kept moving, its head tilted slightly, its blank eyes locked onto mine. I backed away, the cold biting at my skin, but I couldn't tear my gaze away from the impossible figure below the ice. Then, it stopped. It stood directly beneath me, staring up with a smile that sent a chill down my spine. Slowly, it raised its hand again, pressing it against the underside of the ice. I could see the details of its palm, the lines and creases identical to mine, as if it were a perfect copy. My stomach churned as I realized what it was doing. It was knocking. A soft, deliberate tap, tap, tap echoed through the frozen pond, faint but unmistakable. The sound vibrated through the air, making my skin crawl. I stumbled further, my legs trembling, but the reflection didn't follow. It just stood there, its eyes boring into mine, its hands still pressed against the ice. And then it smiled again. The ice cracked. The sound was deafening, shattering the silence of the woods. A jagged line snaked across the surface of the pond, radiating out from where the reflection stood. I turned and ran, my boots slipping on the snow as I fled. The sound of cracking ice followed me, sharp and relentless, like something was chasing me. I didn't look back. The woods blurred around me as I stumbled through the snow, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The trees seemed darker now, their twisted branches reaching out like claws. The ground beneath me felt unstable, every step threatening to give way. Finally, I reached the edge of the woods, the faint outline of my house visible through the trees. Relief flooded me, but it was short-lived. The sound of cracking ice had stopped, replaced by a soft, rhythmic tapping. It was coming from the windows. I froze, my breath fogging the air. The house stood silent and still, but the tapping continued, faint but insistent. Tap, tap, tap. It came from every window, echoing like a heartbeat. My legs felt like lead as I approached, the sound growing louder with each step. When I reached the front door, I hesitated. My hand hovered over the doorknob, my pulse racing. I didn't want to go inside, but I couldn't stay out here, exposed and vulnerable. I turned the knob. Slowly, the door creaking open to reveal the dark interior of my home. The tapping stopped. I stepped inside, locking the door behind me, and turned on the lights. The warm glow chased away the shadows, but it didn't ease the tension in my chest. I moved through the house, cautiously, checking each room, but everything was as I had left it. No signs of anyone or anything side. But when I reached the living room, I froze. The windows were frosted over, just like the surface of the pond. Swirling patterns of ice covered the glass, but in the center of each window was a face, my face. They stared back at me, their expressions blank, their eyes unblinking. Slowly, in perfect unison, they raised their hands and waved. I stumbled back, my heart pounding. The faces didn't move, didn't disappear. They just stared, their smiles widening, the frost spreading across the glass like cracks in a mirror. And then the tapping started again. This time it wasn't coming from the windows. It was coming from the mirror in the hallway. Tap, tap, tap. I turned slowly, dread twisting in my stomach, and saw my reflection standing there. But it wasn't me. It was the thing from the pond, its smile too wide, its eyes too dark. It raised a hand and knocked on the inside of the glass. I ran, the sound of tapping following me as I fled through the house. Every reflective surface, every window, every mirror held a version of me, watching, smiling, waving. The sound grew louder, a deafening symphony of taps that filled the air. I don't know how I escaped. The next thing I remember, I was outside, standing in the snow, staring at the dark silhouette of my house. The windows were clear now, the frost gone, but I knew better than to go back inside. Sometimes, When the nights are cold and the frost returns, I hear it again. The faint sound of tapping, calling to me, reminding me that it's still there, waiting, watching, smiling. The snowstorm hit harder than I expected. What was supposed to be a relaxing weekend of skiing turned into a desperate search for shelter, as the wind howled and the snow came down in thick, blinding sheets. I could barely see a few feet ahead, my body aching from the cold and exhaustion. That's when I saw Ida Lodge, sitting at the base of the mountain, its lights glowing faintly through the storm. Relief flooded me as I stumbled toward it, my boots crunching in the deep snow. The building looked old, but it was warm and inviting compared to the freezing blizzard. Outside, I pushed through the heavy wooden door, the warmth hitting me like a wave. The lobby was cozy, with a roaring fireplace and plush chairs scattered around. The walls were lined with old photographs of skiers and snowy peaks, giving the place a rustic charm. I called out, "Hello? Is anyone here?" My voice echoed faintly, but there was no response. The front desk was empty. A small bell sat on the counter, and I tapped it, the sound sharp and jarring in the silence. Still, no one appeared. I was too tired to question it. There were keys hanging on the wall behind the desk, each labeled with a room number. After a moment of hesitation, I grabbed one marked 207 and made my way upstairs. The hallway was long and dimly lit, the wooden floor creaking under my boots. The air smelled faintly of pine and something else I couldn't quite place. The doors to the other rooms were all closed, but everything was unnervingly quiet. No voices, no footsteps, nothing. It was as though I was the only person in the entire lodge. When I reached my room, I unlocked the door and stepped inside. The room was simple but comfortable, a bed with a heavy quilt, a small table with a lamp, and a window that overlooked the snowy landscape. I peeled off my wet clothes, changed into dry ones, and collapsed onto the bed, exhaustion washing over me. But sleep didn't come easily. The silence of the lodge felt oppressive, almost unnatural. I kept straining to hear something, anything that would indicate another person was there. A laugh, a door creaking, even footsteps in the hallway. But there was nothing, just the faint sound of the wind outside. I tried to convince myself that the storm had scared everyone off, that I had arrived after the lodge had been closed for the night. Maybe the staff had gone home early. Maybe I really was alone. But something about the thought didn't sit right. Around midnight, I heard it, a faint creak, coming from the hallway. My breath caught in my throat as I sat up, straining to listen. The sound came again, slow and deliberate, as though someone was walking down the hall, taking careful steps. I climbed out of bed, my bare feet sinking into the cold wooden floor. My heart pounded as I crept to the door and pressed my ear against it. The footsteps were closer now, stopping just outside my room. I held my breath, every muscle in my body tense. "Hello?" I whispered, my voice barely audible. There was no response, just the sound of the wind howling outside. Slowly, I turned the lock on the door and opened it a crack. The hallway was empty. My stomach churned as I stepped into the hall, glancing up and down its length. The dim lights flickered slightly, casting strange shadows on the walls. The lodge was silent again, as though nothing had happened. I shook my head, trying to shake off the unease. It had to be my imagination. I was overtired. The storm outside was playing tricks on me. I went back to my room and locked the door behind me, but sleep was impossible now. My eyes kept darting to the window, the shadows outside, shifting with the wind. At some point I must have dozed off because I woke to the sound of something tapping. It was faint at first, rhythmic, like someone gently knocking on the glass. I sat up, my heart racing, and turned to the window. A face was staring at me. It was pale, almost ghostly, with hollow eyes and a smile that sent chills down my spine. Figure was pressed against the outside of the window, its breath fogging the glass. I scrambled, out of bed, my back pressing against the far wall, but the figure didn't move. It just stared at me, its smile widening. I reached for the lamp on the table, fumbling to turn it on. But when the room flooded with light, the figure was gone. The window was clear. The snow outside, undisturbed. My breath came in, short gasps, as I stared at the glass, waiting for the face to return. The tapping came again, but this time, it wasn't from the window. It was from the door. I turned slowly, dread twisting in my stomach. The sound was louder now, more insistent. Someone or something was knocking, the rhythm steady and deliberate. I didn't dare move, my eyes fixed on the door as the tapping continued. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice shaking. The tapping stopped. For a long moment there was silence. Then, the doorknob began to turn, the lock clicking softly. I grabbed the lamp from the table, clutching it like a weapon, and backed away as the door creaked open. The hallway was empty. But something was wrong. The lights were flickering more now, casting the walls in alternating shadows and light. The smell was stronger too, that faint, unplaceable odor. It was sweet, sour at the same time, like something decaying. I stepped into the hall, my hands trembling. The lodge felt colder now, the warmth from earlier completely gone. I made my way toward the stairs, desperate to leave, but the hallway seemed longer than before, stretching endlessly in both directions. And then I heard Ita, low, guttural whisper, coming from the end of the hall. I turned, my body, frozen in fear, and saw them. Figures, dozens of them, standing in the shadows. Their faces were pale and blank, their eyes, dark voids. They didn't move, didn't speak. They just stared at me, their presence filling the hall, with an unbearable weight. I ran. I didn't care where I was going. I just needed to get away. The lodge twisted around me, the halls shifting and stretching, as though the building itself was alive. The whispers grew louder, echoing in my ears, until I burst through a door and into the lobby. The fire was gone. The chairs were gone. The room was empty, dark, and cold. The figures were there, standing in a circle, their blank faces turned toward me. They raised their hands in unison, pointing. The last thing I remember is the darkness swallowing me whole. When I woke up, I was outside in the snow, the storm gone, the lodge, nowhere in sight. Stumbled back to my car, my body shaking from the cold. The lodge didn't exist. I tried to find it again, but there was no trace of it. No building, no lights. But I know what I saw. And sometimes, late at night, I hear the tapping again. Faint, rhythmic, as though they're still trying to find me. It started on one of those cold, still nights when the world feels unnaturally quiet. The snow had fallen steadily all day, leaving a thick, undisturbed blanket over everything. By the time the sun set, the town seemed to hold its breath, the streets empty, the air heavy with silence. I had been sitting on my couch, wrapped in a blanket, when I first noticed it. A faint sound, like a soft crunching in the snow. At first, I thought it might be the wind or an animal wandering outside, but the noise was too deliberate, too steady. I brushed it off and told myself I was imagining things. After all, who would be out in weather like this? But then, the motion sensor light above my porch flicked on. I froze, my chest tightening as I stared toward the front door. The curtains were drawn, but the light spilling through the edges cast an eerie glow over the room. Someone was outside. My mind raced with possibilities. Maybe it was a delivery driver, a neighbor in trouble, or even just a prank. But deep down, I felt something wasn't right. I forced myself to stand and move to the window, pulling the curtain back just enough to peek outside. The yard was still and empty, the snow glistening under the light. But what caught my attention were the footprints. They led straight up to my front door. The tracks were fresh, the edges sharp against the untouched snow. But what made my stomach churn was the fact that there were no footprints leading away. Whoever had made them had walked up to my door and never left. My breath fogged the window as I stared at the prints, a cold dread settling over me. I looked out further, scanning the yard, but there was no one in sight. The light on the porch flickered once, and then went out, plunging everything back into darkness. I backed away from the window, my heart pounding. The house felt too quiet now, the kind of silence that makes every creak and groan of the walls feel amplified. I grabbed my phone from the coffee table and hovered my thumb over the keypad. Who would I call? The police? What? Would I even say that someone might be outside my door, but I wasn't sure. A sudden, faint knock broke the silence. I nearly dropped my phone, my body tensing, as the sound echoed through the house. It wasn't loud or aggressive, just a single soft knock. I stared at the door, hands trembling. "Hello?" I called out, my voice shaky. No answer. I approached the door slowly, every instinct telling me to stop, to lock myself in a room, and wait for morning. But curiosity, or maybe fear, pushed me forward. I leaned toward the peephole, my breath catching in my throat as I peered through. Nothing. The porch was empty, the snow undisturbed except for the footprints leading to my door. I exhaled shakily and stepped back, my heart still racing. It was just a prank. Maybe whoever it was had run off before I looked. I tried to convince myself, but the unease in my chest wouldn't go away. I decided to leave the lights on and go to bed, hoping the morning would bring clarity. I locked the door, checked the windows, and double-checked the back door before heading upstairs. My bedroom felt colder than usual, the draft seeping through the old walls. I climbed into bed, pulling the blankets up to my chin, but sleep didn't come easily. Somewhere around 3 a.m. I woke up. At first, I wasn't sure why. The house was dark and silent, the kind of silence that presses against your ears. I lay there, listening, when I heard a faint creak, like a floorboard shifting under weight. My chest tightened, and I held my breath, straining to hear. The sound came again, closer this time. Someone was inside the house. I sat up slowly, my body tense, my mind racing. The stairs creaked faintly, one by one, as if someone was climbing them deliberately, slowly. My bedroom door was closed, but I could feel the presence on the other side. My heart pounded so loudly, for whoever it was could hear it. The footsteps stopped just outside my door. I reached for my phone on the nightstand, but my fingers trembled so badly I nearly dropped it. I fumbled to unlock it, my eyes darting between the door and the screen. Before I could dial, a soft knock sounded, the same gentle tap I had heard earlier. "Who's there?" I whispered, my voice barely audible. No answer. The doorknob turned slowly, the metallic click echoing in the stillness. I couldn't move, frozen, in place as the door creaked open, revealing nothing but darkness. My breath hitched as I stared into the empty hallway. The light from the street lamp outside cast faint shadows across the floor, but there was no one there. I grabbed the lamp from my nightstand, holding it like a weapon, and stepped toward the door. My legs felt weak, my body screaming at me to turn back, but I had to know. I leaned into the pin hallway, my pulse racing. The footprints were there, wet prints, leading from the front door, up the stairs, and stopping just outside my room. But the trail didn't end. It turned, leading into the room across the hall, the guest room. The door was slightly ajar, and the darkness inside felt impossibly deep. I stared at the door, every nerve in my body on edge. The silence was deafening, the air heavy, with something I couldn't name. Slowly, I reached out, pushing the door open. The room was empty, the window shut, but the footprints stopped in the middle of the floor. And then, behind me, I heard a faint, rasping breath. I turned, my blood running cold. The hallway was empty, but I could feel it. Something was there, watching me, just out of sight. The air grew colder, and my vision blurred as my body went rigid with fear. I ran. I didn't stop to grab anything, didn't care about the cold or the snow outside. I just ran, the sound of my own footsteps echoing in my ears as I fled into the night. When I finally looked back, the house stood silent and dark, its windows like empty eyes staring back at me. I never went back. But sometimes, late at night, I still hear that knock, a soft, deliberate tap, as though it's reminding me that it knows where I am. And no matter where I go, I see them, footprints leading up to my door, but none leaving. The wind that night was different. It wasn't just the usual winter gusts that howled through the trees near my cabin. This wind carried a sound with it soft, faint, almost like a whisper. At first, I thought it was my imagination. After all, I had been alone for days, the isolation gnawing at my nerves. But the more I listened, the clearer it became. Someone was calling my name. I froze, my breath fogging the air, as the sound swirled around me. It wasn't coming from the cabin, but from outside, carried on the cold night breeze. The voice was faint, distant, but unmistakable. It was soft, almost soothing, yet there was something unsettling about it. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice trembling. The wind answered with a low, mournful wail, and then the voice came again, clearer this time. It was my name, spoken slowly, deliberately, as if the wind itself was trying to lure me. A chill ran down my spine, and it wasn't just from the cold. I knew I should have ignored it, locked the door, and stayed inside, but curiosity and something I couldn't quite explain drew me to the door. When I stepped outside, the world was silent, except for the wind. The trees stood tall and motionless, their branches coated in ice that shimmered faintly under the moonlight. The snow crunched beneath my boots as I took a few cautious steps forward. Then the voice called again, and this time it sounded closer. It was coming from the woods. I hesitated, staring into the dark line of trees that bordered the clearing. My instincts told me to go back, to shut the door and forget I had heard anything. But the voice, there was something familiar about it. It sounded like someone I knew, though I couldn't quite place who. The pull was irresistible. I stepped into the woods, the shadows swallowing me as I left the clearing behind. The trees loomed above, their branches creaking in the wind. The voice called again, soft and coaxing, leading me deeper into the forest. My heart pounded in my chest, each step feeling heavier than the last. "Who are you?" I called out, my voice echoing faintly. No answer, just the sound of the wind and the faint, distant voice. The snow grew deeper as I walked, slowing my progress. The trees seemed to close in around me, their shadows twisting and shifting in the dim light. The air felt colder here, heavier, as if forest itself was holding its breath. I reached a small clearing and stopped. The voice had gone silent. The wind, too, had stilled, leaving an eerie, oppressive silence in its wake. I turned in a slow circle, my breath quickening. The forest felt wrong now, as though it was watching me. And then I saw it. A figure stood at the edge of the clearing, barely visible in the shadows. It was tall and thin, its features obscured by the darkness. My stomach churned as it took a step forward, the snow crunching beneath its feet. The faint light of the moon revealed a face pale, hollow, and unfamiliar. But the eyes were impossibly dark, pulling me in like black holes. The figure spoke, and my blood turned to ice. It was my voice, distorted and wrong, echoing back at me. "What do you want?" I demanded, taking a step back. It didn't answer. Instead, it raised a hand and pointed deeper into the woods. My heart pounded as I followed its gaze, and that's when I saw the path, a narrow trail cutting through the trees, the snow on it untouched. The figure stepped back into the shadows, disappearing as though it had never been there. The voice returned, whispering my name from the direction of the trail. I should have turned back. I should have run, but something stronger than pulled me forward, compelling me to follow the path. My legs moved almost on their own, carrying me deeper into the forest. The trail wound through the trees, the silence growing heavier with every step. The voice grew, louder, clearer, until it no longer sounded like it was carried by the wind. It was ahead of me, now, leading me towards something I couldn't see. Finally, I reached another clearing, and what I saw made my breath catch in my throat. A small cabin stood in the center, its windows dark and lifeless. The roof was caved in, the wood warped and rotting. It looked like it had been abandoned for decades. But there was something familiar about it, something that made my chest tighten with dread. The voice spoke again, coming from inside the cabin. I stepped forward, the snow crunching beneath my boots, and reached the door. My hand trembled as I pushed it open. The hinges groaned, the sound echoing into the darkness beyond. Inside, the air was freezing, colder than the night outside. The walls were lined with old photographs, their frames cracked and faded. I moved closer, squinting at the images, and my stomach churned. They were pictures of me. Every photograph showed me at different points in my life: childhood, birthdays, vacations, even moments I couldn't remember. The frames were arranged in a chaotic collage, covering the walls from floor to ceiling. In the center of the room stood a mirror, its surface cracked, cloudy. I approached it slowly, my reflection distorted by the damaged glass. But as I stared, the reflection began to move on its own. It raised a hand and waved, its face twisting into a wide, unnatural smile. The voice whispered again, this time coming from the mirror itself. "You found me." The reflection's eyes darkened, turning into endless voids, and the room began to shift. The walls closed in, the photographs melting away, replaced by darkness. The air grew heavier, suffocating, as the voice grew louder, overlapping with itself in a maddening chorus. I stumbled back, my legs giving out as the room dissolved around me. The last thing I saw was the reflection stepping out of the mirror, its smile widening as it reached for me. When I woke up, I was lying in the snow, the morning sun breaking through the trees. The cabin was gone. The trail was gone. But the voice was still there, faint and distant, carried on the wind, calling my name. And I know one day it will lead me back. It started late one night when I was alone at home. The storm outside was relentless, the wind howling and rattling the windows. Rain lashed against the glass, and every so often, thunder rolled through the sky, making the house shudder. I was curled up on the couch, trying to lose myself in a book, but the storm made it hard to focus. Then I heard it. Knock, knock, knock. It was faint at first, almost lost beneath the sound of the storm. My head jerked up, and I glanced around, trying to figure out where it had come from. The rain was still pounding, and I told myself it was just a branch tapping against the window or some loose siding moving in the wind. I went back to my book, but then it came again. Knock, knock, knock. This time it was louder, more deliberate. My heart skipped a beat, and I put the book down, straining to listen. The sound was coming from the living room window, the one just a few feet away. The curtains were drawn, and the thought of what might be on the other side made my skin crawl. I stood slowly, the floor creaking under my weight, and approached the window. My hands trembled as I reached for the curtain, hesitating for a moment before pulling it back. There was nothing there. The yard was dark and empty, the rain coming down in heavy sheets. The only light came from the faint glow of the porch light, which illuminated the empty space outside the window. My pulse was racing, but I tried to laugh it off. It was just the storm. The wind must have blown something against the glass. I closed the curtain and sat back down, trying to shake off the unease. But then it came again. Knock, knock, knock. This time it was louder and more insistent. It sounded like knuckles rapping against the glass, deliberate and purposeful. My stomach churned as I turned back toward the window. The curtain fluttered slightly, as though someone had brushed against it. "Hello?" I called out, my voice trembling. "Is someone there?" No answer. I grabbed my phone from the coffee table, clutching it tightly as I crept back to the window. My fingers brushed the curtain, but I couldn't bring myself to pull it back this time. My reflection stared back at me in the faint light, pale and wide-eyed. The knocking came again, and I jumped, nearly dropping my phone. Knock, knock, knock. It wasn't coming from the living room window anymore. It was coming from the kitchen. My breath hitched as I turned toward the sound. The house felt colder now, the shadows deeper and more oppressive. I moved cautiously toward the kitchen, every step feeling heavier than the last. When I reached the window, I froze. The rain streaked the glass, distorting my view of the yard, but I couldn't see anything outside. I pressed my hand against the window pane, the cold seeping through my skin, and squinted into the darkness. A flash of lightning lit up the yard, and for a brief second, I saw a figure standing just beyond the porch, barely visible through the rain. It was tall and motionless, its face obscured by the shadows. My heart raced as the light faded, plunging the yard back into darkness. I stumbled back, my chest heaving, and grabbed the nearest object, a kitchen knife. My hand shook as I gripped it tightly, my mind racing. Who was out there? And why were they knocking? On my windows in the middle of the storm? The knocking started again, this time from the bedroom window. Knock, knock, knock. It was closer now, as though the figure was moving around the house, circling it like a predator. Backed into the living room, the knife clutched tightly in my hand, and grabbed my phone to call someone. But the screen flickered and went dark, refusing to turn on. The lights in the house flickered too, the shadows on the walls seeming to shift and stretch unnaturally. The knocking grew louder, more insistent, coming from multiple windows at once. Now, knock, knock, knock. I turned in a circle, trying to keep track of the sound. It was everywhere, echoing through the house, coming from every direction. My chest tightened as the air grew colder, my breath visible in the dim light. Then, the knocking stopped. The silence was worse than the sound. My ears strained for any noise, but all I could hear was the faint sound of the rain and my own ragged breathing. I crept toward the living room window, my feet barely making a sound on the floor. Slowly, I reached for the curtain and pulled it back. A face was pressed against the glass. It wasn't human. Its skin was pale and wet, stretched tight over sharp, angular features. Its eyes were black, endless voids that seemed to pull me in, and its mouth was twisted into a wide, unnatural grin. It tilted its head, staring at me, and raised a hand to tap on the glass. Knock, knock, knock. I screamed and stumbled back, the knife slipping from my hand and clattering to the floor. When I looked back at the window, the face was gone. The yard was empty again, the storm raging on, as if nothing had happened. The knocking started again, this time from the front door. I didn't want to answer it. I didn't want to go near it. But something compelled me to move, my legs carrying me toward the door despite every instinct screaming at me to stop. The knocking grew louder as I approached, the sound reverberating through the house. Knock, knock, knock. My hand trembled as I reached for the doorknob. I turned it slowly, the hinges creaking as the door swung open. The porch was empty, but the footprints in the rain-soaked ground told a different story. They led up to the door, large, deep prints that didn't match any shoe I had ever seen. They weren't footprints at all. They were claw marks. The door slammed shut behind me, and the lights in the house went out completely. The knocking started again, louder and more frantic, coming from every window, every wall, surrounding me. And then, a voice whispered in the darkness, "Let me in. I haven't slept since that night. I left the house the next morning, but the knocking followed me. No matter where I go, no matter how far I run, I hear it again. Knock, knock, knock." The snowstorm was unrelenting, a blinding sheet of white that seemed determined to swallow everything in its path. The wind howled through the trees, its icy fingers clawing at my face. Despite the layers I'd wrapped around myself, I had been hiking back to the cabin when the storm hit, turning what should have been a straightforward walk into a nightmare. My footprints disappeared behind me almost as soon as I made them, and every direction looked the same. Endless, featureless snow. I was beginning to lose hope when I saw it. Through the swirling snow, a dark shape emerged, barely visible against the blizzard. At first, thought it might be a rock or a fallen tree, but as I got closer, I realized it was something else. Entirely. A snowmobile. It stood out starkly against white, its metal body dusted with snow, but otherwise intact. Relief flooded me. Maybe whoever had left it here could help me, or at the very least, it might mean shelter was nearby. But as I approached, my relief turned to unease. The snowmobile was still warm. The seat radiated heat when I placed my gloved hand on it, and the engine clicked faintly, the sound of metal cooling after use. Someone had been here recently. Very recently. Yet there were no footprints around it. No signs of anyone walking away. It was as though the rider had vanished into thin air. "Hello?" I called out, my voice barely audible over the wind. "Is anyone there?" No response. I glanced around, scanning the endless expanse of snow. There was nothing, no movement, no shapes, nothing but the storm. My chest tightened as an uneasy feeling settled over me. Something about this wasn't right. I debated what to do. The snowmobile could be a lifeline, a way to get back to safety, but it wasn't mine. And the thought of riding it, knowing its owner might return at any moment, sent a chill down my spine that had nothing to do with the cold. Then I noticed something else. There was a bag strapped to the back of the snowmobile, partially unzipped, its contents hidden by the flurry of snow clinging to it. I hesitated, but curiosity got the better of me. I reached out and pulled the zipper down further. Inside was a thick bundle of clothing, gripped, bloodied, and stiff with frost. I stumbled back, my heart pounding. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what I had just seen. The blood was dark and dried, but there was no body, no signs of a struggle. Just the clothes and the snowmobile still warm. A sound broke through the storm, a low, almost imperceptible hum. It wasn't the wind or the distant roar of the blizzard. It was mechanical, faint and rhythmic, and it was coming from somewhere nearby. I turned in the direction of the sound, squinting through the snow, and then I saw them. Tracks. Snowmobile tracks leading away from the machine, clear path through the storm. My breath caught in my throat. The tracks weren't there before I was certain of it. They stretched out into the distance, disappearing into the white void. "Hello?" I called again, my voice trembling. Still no answer. My gut screamed at me to turn back, to leave the snowmobile and the tracks and find my way home. But something about the tracks drew me in, an invisible pull that I couldn't resist. Against my better judgment, I began to follow them. The storm seemed to grow quieter as I walked, the wind less biting but the air colder, heavier. The tracks led me deeper into the forest, the trees looming on either side like silent sentinels. Humming grew louder, more distinct, but I couldn't place what it was. It sounded almost like an engine idling, but warped, distorted. I don't know how long I followed the tracks, minutes, hours. Time felt strange in the storm, and the cold was beginning to seep into my bones. Just when I thought I couldn't take another step, I saw it. A second snowmobile, identical to the first, sitting in the middle of a clearing. It was warm, too, the heat radiating from its engine like a faint glow in the icy air. And just like the first, there were no footprints, no signs of anyone around, only the tracks that led up to it. My breath came in quick, shallow gasps as I stared at the machine. The humming was louder, now almost deafening, and it seemed to come from all around me. The storm swirled violently, the snow closing in like a wall, but the clearing remained untouched. I took a step closer, and the hum stopped. The silence was suffocating, pressing against my ears like a weight. My heart pounded as I scanned the clearing, my eyes darting between the trees. The unease I'd felt before had grown into full-blown terror. I turned to leave, to follow my own tracks back to the cabin. But when I looked down, the tracks were gone. The snow was pristine, unbroken, as if I had never been there. I wasn't alone. A shape moved in the corner of my vision, just beyond the edge of the clearing. I spun around, my pulse racing, but there was nothing there. Then, another movement, a shadow darting between the trees, too fast to follow. "Who's there?" I shouted, my voice cracking. No answer, just the oppressive silence and the faint crunch of snow growing closer. I backed toward the snowmobile, my hands trembling. The shadows moved again, circling me, their shapes barely visible through the storm. They weren't human, that much I could tell. Their movements were jerky, unnatural, as though they didn't belong in this world. The humming returned, low and menacing, vibrating through the ground. The snowmobile's engine sputtered to life, though I hadn't touched it, the headlights cutting through the darkness like twin beacons. The light illuminated the trees, and for a split second, I saw them. Dozens of figures, pale and gaunt, their hollow eyes fixed on me. Their mouths were twisted into grotesque grins, sharp teeth glinting in the light. They didn't move, but the humming grew, louder, more insistent, as if urging me toward the machine. I didn't think. I jumped onto the snowmobile, my hands fumbling for the controls. The engine roared, and the machine lurched forward, the tracks forming beneath me as I sped away from the clearing. The figures didn't follow, but I could feel their gaze, cold and piercing, as I fled into the storm. When I finally reached the cabin, I stumbled inside, slamming the door behind me. My body shook violently, whether from the cold or fear, I couldn't tell. The storm had eased, the wind howling softly now, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The next morning, I went back to where I had found the first snowmobile. There was nothing there. No machine, no tracks, not even the clearing where I'd seen the figures. Just endless snow, untouched and silent. But sometimes, late at night, I hear it again, the low hum, faint and distant, calling to me through the wind. And I know, whatever I found out there, it's still waiting.